Chapter 1 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Puss starts out on his travels. "Father," exclaimed Puss in Boots, Jr., one fine day as he and the famous Puss in Boots sat together in the garden adjoining the castle of my Lord Carabas, "I feel I should not trespass longer on the hospitality of your good master, but should go forth to seek my fortune." "What has put such an idea into your head?" asked his father anxiously. "My Lord of Carabas only yesterday remarked that he was happy to know you were here to gladden my old age." "But yet and all," replied Puss, Jr., "I would see more of the world." "Tut, tut!" exclaimed his father. "I have been seneschal these many years to my Lord of Carabas. Never have I wished to see the world again. Once was enough for me, and a hard task it was to procure for my lord this very castle outside of whose walls you now sit and wish that you were elsewhere. The story of my life has been written, and every child who reads Puss in Boots knows full well how I helped my master in the days of his poverty and trouble." "'Tis true, dear father," answered Puss, Jr., "and although I had many adventures ere I found you, still I would see more of this great world." For some time neither spoke. Then the venerable Puss, Sr., arose, and placing his right paw upon his son's shoulder, said in a low, trembling voice, "When all the world is young, lad, and all the trees are green, and every goose a swan, lad, and every lass a queen, then hey for boot and horse, lad, and round the world away. Young blood must have its course, lad, and every dog his day." "Then you give me your permission to go out and seek my fortune?" cried Puss, Jr. "Yes, my son," replied the old cat, turning away to hide his tears. But Puss, Jr., didn't see the tears. He was so delighted to think he could once more go upon a journey of adventure that he ran up to the marble steps of the castle with a hop, a skip, and a jump, and when he reached his room it took him but a few minutes to pack his knapsack. Then, placing his cap with its trailing feather securely on his head, he grasped his trusty sword and hurried down the stairs. "Good luck, my son!" cried his father, as Puss, Jr. threw his paws about him. "Be a good cat, and all will go well with you." Well, Puss had gone but a little way when he came to a post on which was the big sign, "He who eats of this gingerbread will be thrown into prison." And right at the foot of the post was a big loaf of gingerbread. Now I don't know but what Puss might have disobeyed and tasted that gingerbread loaf, if all of a sudden two of his old friends, the good gray horse and little dog Buff, hadn't come along. "Get on my back, little master," cried the good gray horse, and then he ran swiftly away with little Puss, Jr., safely on his back. For that wise old horse wasn't going to leave Puss near that nice cake of gingerbread, let me tell you. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Travel of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Puss meets a scarecrow. Now wasn't that lucky that Puss found his old friend the good gray horse, as I mentioned in the last story. For when one starts out on his travels, it's mighty nice to be on horseback instead of one's own legs. Let me tell you. Well, after our three friends, Puss, the good gray horse, and the little dog Buff, had gone for maybe a mile or maybe more, they heard a voice call out,
"Wait a minute, if you please. My pants are bagging at the knees. My old silk hat is almost off. And goodness me, I've got a cough. To tell the truth, I'm tired out with scaring crows from here about."
and Puss saw a scarecrow in the field. "Did you speak to me just now in rhyme?" asked our little traveler.
"Yes, I did,"
answered the scarecrow, flapping his arms about till he nearly fell over, and he would have if the pole on which he hung hadn't been placed in the ground very firmly.
"If you'll take me with you, I'll tell you lots of things of the man who once owned my coat was a great traveler, and the man who owned my old silk hat was an actor, and the man who wore my trousers was a conductor on a passenger train, and the farmer who put me on this pole has made lots of money and owns an automobile."
"But if you come with us, who will stay to keep the naughty crows away?" asked Puss.
"I don't care,"
replied the scarecrow.
"They all know I'm only an old clothes man. They're not the least bit afraid of me. Only this morning one of them sat on my hat and laughed when I told him to fly away."
"But how are you going to walk?" asked the good gray horse. "You can't ride me, for I won't have you."
"You just pull the pole out of the ground and set me free," replied the scarecrow, "and I'll walk on my own two legs, even if they're only made of straw. I'll show you."
So the good gray horse jumped over the low stone wall, and taking the pole between his strong teeth, pulled it out of the earth and set the scarecrow free. And then that scarecrow gave a loud yell and jumped over the stone wall like a college man. And then he said,
"Let's be off to seek adventure, for I'm so happy I am free that I could swim across the sea."
So off they started, Puss on the gray horse, and the scarecrow following with little dog Buff by his side. And by they came to a town called Happyville.
"This is the place for me,"
cried the scarecrow.
"I'll treat you all to an ice cream soda."
And in the next story you shall hear more about these four jolly comrades. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Katie Foley. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Wagon Ride. In the story before this, we left off just as Puss Jr. on his good gray horse and the scarecrow with little dog Buff by his side were entering the town of Happyville. You remember. And the scarecrow had remarked, "Let us get an ice cream soda." But how he knew anything about ice cream sodas puzzles me, and maybe it puzzles you. But just the same, that's what he said. "Let's all get an ice cream soda." "I'll take a quart of oats, if it's all the same to you," said the good gray horse. "And I'll take a bone, if you don't mind," said little dog Buff. "And I'll take cream without any ice and soda, if you don't care," added Puss Jr. "Have what you like," said the scarecrow kindly, and he put his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a big roll of bills. "I've got enough money to pay for anything and everything, thanks to the great traveler who once owned my coat." And he laughed a big hearty laugh and slammed a $20 bill down on the counter, and the soda water man jumped nearly over the showcase, he was so surprised. Well, after everybody had eaten the thing he liked best, they started off once more, and by they came to a wagon shop, and just outside stood a beautiful new wagon with yellow wheels and a blue body. "If you can draw that wagon," said the Scarecrow, "I'll buy it." "Of course I can," replied the Good Gray Horse, for the Scarecrow had spoken to him, only I didn't think to say so till this very second. "How much?" asked the Scarecrow of the wagon builder, who came out of his shop to look at our four friends. Well, the price wasn't too much, so the kind Scarecrow bought it, and a nice set of harness, too, for the Gray Horse, and pretty soon they were rattling down the road with Puss Jr. holding the reins, and the Scarecrow and Buff on the rear seat. "This is much better than walking on straw feet," remarked the Scarecrow, "and much faster, too. We'll get somewhere now if we only keep going." And you can just bet they kept going. The way the Good Gray Horse threw out his heels was simply wonderful, and the way those yellow wheels went around was simply marvelous. Why, they went so fast that the spokes seemed all to run into one another and make a great round yellow moon, and everybody bumped up and down, for the road was rough. But nobody cared, for he was so happy, was each little traveler. Well, after a little while, the old silk hat blew off the Scarecrow's head, and Puss Jr. had to stop and let him out, and while he was running back to pick it up, Rowley the Frog, who would a whooping go, you know, jumped out a little pool of water by the roadside and began to be taken along. "Jump in," said Puss Jr. with a grin, "the more the merrier." And now we must wait until the next story to hear what happened after that. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karma Emmings. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Wicked Lord. Well, as I was saying in the story before this, Rowley, the frog who would a woo and go whether his mother would let him or no, jumped into the wagon with Puss Jr. and his friends, the Scarecrow and Little Dog Buff, and away they went. And, this time, you may be sure the Scarecrow pushed his old silk hat way down on his head so it wouldn't blow off again. By and by they came to a bridge. One of those very old-fashioned bridges, you know, all covered over like a big long barn. And, when they got right in the middle, an old owl flew down from the roof and sat on the front seat next to Puss Jr. "Take me with you, dear Puss Jr.," he said. "Only first, let me put on my green goggles, for the daylight hurts my eyes." "Come along," cried Puss, but the Good Gray Horse turned his head around and said, "I don't mind an owl, or another pussycat, or a little boy and girl, but please don't ask an elephant to get in and ride, for that would be too much of a load for even my strong legs." "Don't worry, dear comrade," said Puss. "There are no elephants in New Mother Goose Land, neither is there room in this wagon for so large an animal." This evidently contented the Good Gray Horse, for he trotted along as nicely as you please, and by they came to a great castle on a hill. "Who lives yonder?" asked Puss, but nobody knew. So the Good Gray Horse kept right on up the road till he came to the castle. And then Rowley the Frog gave a great honk honk, just like an automobile horn, you know, and the gates swung open. Then in trotted the Gray Horse with his wagon load of funny folks, and the keeper of the gates could hardly keep from smiling. "Tell the lord of this stately castle," cried little Puss Jr., "that the son of the famous Puss in Boots has brought his friends with him to make a call." "Very good, Sir Cat," said the keeper of the gates respectfully, and he bowed low and retired within the castle, and presently he reappeared and invited them all to come in. Now the lord of this stately castle was not a very good man. He not only robbed everyone who passed his lands, but made prisoners of many and held them for ransom. So, as soon as he heard that the son of the famous Puss in Boots was outside, he chuckled to himself and said under his breath, "Ha ha! Now for a princely ransom!" But he never said anything like that to Puss, who entered at that moment. Oh no! He was most polite and offered them all a seat. But by and by he said, "Don't you want to look over my castle?" And when he got the chance, he locked Little Dog Buff in a closet, and Rowley Frog in a spare room, and the Scarecrow in a chamber. But he waited until the last to make Puss Jr. a prisoner. And I'm sorry that I have no more room in this story to tell you what happened after that, so wait until the next story, please, little reader, and then I'll tell you. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karma Emmings. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. The Rescue. We had to leave off in the last story, just at the exciting part. It was just after the wicked lord of the castle had locked up Puss Jr.'s friends, you remember. And while this wicked lord was wondering what to do with Puss, all of a sudden our little hero drew his sword and said fiercely, "What have you done with my friends? Where are they, my lord?" But he only laughed and replied, "Never question the hospitality of your host, Sir Cat. Your friends are in the garden looking at the roses." And then he blew a silver whistle, and immediately 4 big soldiers appeared. "Bind Sir Cat and throw him in the dungeon." And before Puss in Boots Jr. could defend himself, he was bound and taken away. And oh dear me, it was dark and gloomy in that deep dungeon, for it only had a small window way up high with iron bars across it. Poor little Puss sat down on a rough wooden bench and tried hard not to be miserable. For the first time in his life he felt he was in great danger. How long he sat there he did not know, when all of a sudden a squeaky little voice said to him, "Cheer up, Puss Jr., I will help you." And looking down, he saw a little mouse at his feet. "Are you not afraid I will eat you?" asked Puss sadly. "Not in the slightest," replied the little mouse. "Take heart, my friend. I will run to the tool house and bring you a file, with which you may cut the iron bars and so make your escape." And then the little mouse disappeared, and when she returned, she had a file in her mouth. Well, it took Puss some time to saw through those grey iron bars, but at last he did, and then he squeezed through and climbed down to the ground. "But how am I to save my friends?" he asked himself. Then he suddenly thought of the good knight, Sir Lancelot of the Lake. So, without a moment's delay, he set off at a rapid pace, and by nightfall reached the court of good King Arthur. It did not take him long to tell Sir Lancelot his troubles, and in a short time that noble knight with 10 others were hurrying back with Puss to the rescue. The wicked lord saw them coming, but before he could escape, they surrounded the castle, battered down the gates, and entered the courtyard. Here a fierce battle took place, the lord of the castle striving to overcome the brave Sir Lancelot. But right always wins in the end, and at length the wicked lord was forced to surrender and give over the castle to the Knights of the Round Table. In a short time, Little Dog Buff, the Scarecrow, and Rolly Frog were set at liberty, and then Puss took his 3 friends in the wagon and drove away with Sir Lancelot and his brave knights. And in the next story, I will tell you some more adventures that Puss Jr. had while on his travels through New Mother Gooseland. End of Chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. The Little Hut in the Wood. As Puss Jr. drove off in the wagon with his 3 friends, Little Dog Buff, the Scarecrow, and Rolly Frog, the good gray horse turned his head and said, "Isn't it nice once more to be free?" And the reason he said that, you remember, was because in the last story, our friends had been imprisoned in the castle of the wicked lord. But thanks to the help of the little mouse, Puss had rushed off to the court of King Arthur and had brought Sir Launcelot and his knights to the rescue. I don't know why I'm telling you this all over again, except for the reason that perhaps some little boy or girl may not have read what has gone before. Well, Puss and his friends hadn't gone very far when Mr. Rolly Frog met a cousin of his. You see, they had just come to a pond by the roadside, and the frog who owned the pond was sitting on a log. And when he saw Mr. Rolly Frog, he called out, "Hello, Rolly! Where are you going?" And Mr. Rolly Frog said, "Oh, please stop the wagon." And Puss pulled up the good gray horse, and out jumped the frog and went over and shook hands with his cousin. "I guess I'll make him a visit," he said. So Puss drove on, and by they came to a little doghouse by the roadside, and the big yellow dog that lived there called out to Buff, "Hello there, Cousin Buff. Where are you going?" And then Buff jumped out and said, "Goodbye." So Puss drove on some more, and by they came to a cornfield, and there, right in the middle, stood a scarecrow. And when he saw our friend, the Scarecrow, sitting in the back seat of the wagon, he called out, "Hello there, Cousin Scarecrow. And of course the Scarecrow wanted to make a visit in the cornfield, and so Puss drove on with nobody in the wagon except himself. "Once more we are alone, good comrade," he said to the good gray horse. "Well, as we are alone again, you and I, little master, let us leave the wagon here, for we can travel faster without this four-wheeled cart." So Puss unhitched the good gray horse, and mounting his back once more, rode off through a shady path in the woods. And after he had gone for some distance, he came to a woodcutter's lodge, a humble little hut made of logs, with a chimney which was nothing more than a hole in the roof, with a sort of roof over that to keep out the rain. And in the doorway stood the poor woodcutter, looking here and there as if expecting someone to return. And when he saw Puss, he ran forward and inquired if he had seen his wife. "She has a red shawl and carried the baby in her arms." "No, I have seen no one," replied Puss Jr. "I am worried," said the woodcutter. "'Tis several hours since she left, and she should be back by this time." And just then a bird began to sing, and as they listened, they heard it say, "Over the hills and far away, with her baby on her arm, I saw a tired woman today stop at a busy farm." End of chapter 6. Read by Snow Owl, Northwest Ohio, May 2023.
Chapter 7 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Mooly Mooly Cow, Come Away Home. As the little bird stopped singing the song I told you about in the last story, the figure of a woman came in sight. "There she is!" cried the woodcutter, and he ran toward her with a glad cry. "Where have you been?" he asked, and the woman replied, "To a farm to get some milk for the baby, for it was fretful today, and our cow has wandered away." And the little bird began singing, "Oh, Mooly Cow, come away home. Why all the day did you wander and roam? The dear little baby was hungry, I know. Oh, Mooly Cow, why did you go?" And then all of a sudden they heard a cow mooing in the distance. Mmm. And in a few minutes who should come in sight but the cow that jumped over the moon. And as soon as she saw Puss, Jr., she quickened her steps and in a few minutes was close at his side. "I got lost in the woods," she said, "and oh dear me, I had such a time finding my way back. But here I am, and Mr. Woodcutter, if you will only milk me, I'll give I don't know how many quarts of milk, for I found some lovely grass by a little brook. Oh, it's good to be home," she sighed, a great big sigh, and waited for the woodcutter to bring out his milking pail. "Tell me how you came here," said Puss, sitting down on a log, while the good gray horse whinnied and smiled at the cow that jumped over the moon. "Oh, I grew tired of the old farm," she replied, "and one day I wandered off into the woods, and when I came to this little cabin it looked so sweet and comfortable, I just stayed here. That was before the baby came, you see, and now I couldn't go away until he grows up to be a big strong man." And just then the woodcutter came out with his milking pail, and when he finished milking, it was so full that it ran over and made a little milk puddle. And Puss drank it all up, for he was hungry with his long journey. "You shall have some cake too," said the woodcutter's wife. "Will you wait until I put baby to bed?" So Puss took off his boots and stretched himself out and I guess he fell asleep to the tune of lullaby which she sang to the baby. Sleep, little baby, mother is nigh. Look at the twinkle star up in the sky. Down through the treetops it shines with a light that looks like a diamond, it glitters so bright. Sleep, little baby, for mother is nigh, and the twinkle star shining at you from the sky. And the good gray horse kept on munching the soft grass, and by the woodcutter's wife came out and put Puss to bed, and he never woke up. He was so very, very tired until the next day. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Giant of the Merry Laugh. The next morning when Puss, Jr. woke up, he was surprised to find himself in the woodcutter's cottage. For you remember in the last story, he had fallen asleep and had never waked up when the kind woodcutter's wife put him to bed. Well, as soon as he had his breakfast, he took out his purse and gave her a gold piece. "Keep it for baby," he said with a grin, as he jumped into the saddle and said, "Giddy up!" to his faithful gray horse. Then on he rode for many miles until he came to a deep river. There was no bridge anywhere in sight, and he was just about to turn away and seek another road when he heard a voice say, "Whistle 3 times, Sir Cat, and the ferry boat that goes to Toy Town will take you over." So Puss did as he was told, and presently a ferry boat came up close to the bank, and Puss urged his good gray horse over the gangplank which the sailors put out, and soon he was aboard and out in the middle of the stream. Pretty soon the captain came down from the pilot house and began to talk, and he told Puss that Toy Town was a lovely place where all the dolls could talk and railroad cars would run without winding, and the tops spin themselves. "I shall be glad to see them," said our little traveler, "for I've never been to a town where there are such queer people, except perhaps Alphabet Town, where the letters are all alive, and you have to be an artist to write a letter." And Puss laughed and told the captain all about Alphabet Town, and as the captain had never been there, he was very much interested, and said some day, when he grew rich enough, he'd sell his ferry boat and go traveling. Well, after the boat reached the other side, Puss guided his good gray horse over the gangplank and rode away after paying the captain 2 pennies, for that was the fare. And after he had ridden for many miles, he came to a castle where lived a giant. Now this giant was a very kind sort of a big man, and liked little people. And when he saw Puss astride of the good gray horse, he laughed long and loud, and said in a voice that sounded like a thunderclap, "Ho, ho there, my little friend in red top boots. Where are you going? Stop and make me a visit." "Well, maybe I'm afraid to," said little Puss. "I once had a narrow escape from the giant of the beanstalk. I may have a hard time with you." But the giant laughed this time, and he laughed so very low that it only sounded like distant thunder. "Never fear, little cat," he said kindly. "Come inside and see my castle. Then you shall go on your way, and when you see your father, tell him you met the giant of the merry laugh, who had to look through a magnifying glass to see your whiskers." And then the giant laughed so hard that all the apples fell off the tree. So Puss entered the castle, and in the next story you shall hear of another adventure that Puss had. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Puss buys a new pair of boots. As Puss entered the castle, which belonged to the giant of the merry laugh, as I told you in the last story, he almost stumbled over a giant mouse. It was the largest mouse Puss had ever seen. Indeed, it was almost as big as he was. So you can see it must have been a pretty large mouse.
"Well, I'm not afraid of you,"
he said with a very loud squeak. Then he whisked his long tail and laughed at Puss.
"Look here,"
cried the giant of the merry laugh.
"Don't you know who this is? This is Puss Jr."
And when the giant mouse heard that, he said,
"Pleased to meet you, Sir Cat. I have often heard of you from the little people of Mother Goose."
And then he put out his paw and shook hands with our small traveler. And after that the giant showed Puss all over the castle, and many strange things were there. And they were all so very big that it made Puss feel dreadfully small. And he was very glad when it was time to say good-bye, for he wasn't used to such great big things, you know. So he mounted his good gray horse and rode away, and by he came to a blacksmith shop, where he stopped and had the smith look at the shoes on the good gray horse, for a traveler is always careful to see that the shoes on his steed are in good repair. "Tick-tack 2 or 3, give the horse a shoe. Here's a nail that will not fail. Tick-tack 2. Can you put a shoe on me?" asked Puss with a grin. "No, my little cat," replied the smith, "but there's a cobbler in town who will do the trick. His shop is down the street a ways." So after the good gray horse was showed, Puss rode off, and by he came to the boot shop. And right in front of his door sat the cobbler, a little old man with a bent back and knotty hands, and when he saw Puss he said,
"Shall I make you a boot, Sir Cat, today? I have a pair that is laid away upon the shelf with red tops too. Come, let me sell them now to you."
"Very well," replied our little traveler. "If they fit me, I will buy them, for mine are indeed shabby with much travel." So the old bootmaker got down the boots, and they fitted Puss without a wrinkle. "What is the price?" he asked, gazing down at them with a grin. "They fit me well, but will the price?"
"Make me an offer, Sir Cat," replied the cobbler, "and if you are as generous as you are good-looking, they are yours."
So Puss took the gold piece from his purse, and the shoes were his. And after that he set off once more upon his travels. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Old Friends. You remember in the last story how Puss bought a new pair of boots, don't you? Wasn't it lucky that the old cobbler had a pair already made that would fit? For how could Puss in Boots, Jr. continue his travels without red-topped boots? I would like to know, and so would you. Well, after that he rode away on his good gray horse down the road, leaving the little village behind until the church spire looked like a needle pointing up into the clouds. And after a while he came to a sheepfold where there were many little lambs at play. So Puss climbed up on the fence to watch them, and pretty soon an old sheep came over, and, would you believe it, it was Mary's little lamb. Only it had grown up to be a big lamb, you know, and had some little lambs of its own. "Have you seen Mary?" it asked, and then 2 big tears rolled down its cheeks, for it was very fond of Mary, although it had been a long, long time ago since Mary had taken it to school. Well, before Puss could answer, who should come by with a little boy but Mary herself? And when she saw Puss, she said, for at first she didn't remember the sheep, for it was grown so big, you see, "Hello, little Puss, Jr. Where have you been, and where are you going?" "Yes, where are you going?" said little Tommy Tucker, for that was the name of the boy. "I don't sing for my supper any more. I live with the old woman who lives in a shoe." And he climbed up on the fence and sat beside Puss, while Mary played with the little lamb. We have a phonograph that sings all my songs. And then all of a sudden a blackbird flew down from the sky and pecked at Puss Jr.'s nose. But he was only in fun, you know, and when Puss looked at him he saw he was the same blackbird who on a Monday morning had pecked at the nose of the maid who in the garden was hanging out the clothes. "Don't you do that again," said Puss, "for I remember how you hurt that poor maid's nose, and how I had to go to town to fetch Dr. Foster, and you should have outgrown such tricks by this time." "Yes, you bad bird," cried Mary. "If you want to pinch noses, go into the woods and find Old Mother Witch. She has a long hooked nose and a wicked heart, but you let nice people alone." And this made the blackbird dreadfully ashamed of himself. So he said, "If you go with me, Puss Jr., I'll tweak Old Mother Witch's nose as sure as I am black." "I'll go with you," replied our little hero, and after asking Mary to take the good gray horse home with her, he followed the blackbird into the forest. And in the next story you shall hear what happened there. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Old Mother Witch. Puss Jr. followed the blackbird deep into the forest. I hope you remember why they were going there, but if you don't, I'll remind you. The blackbird had made up his mind to give Old Mother Witch's nose a pinch, and a pinch twice as hard as the one he gave the nose of the maiden in the garden hanging out the clothes. And that was quite a pinch, I guess, as everybody knows, for the king who was so busy a-counting of his money, and the queen who was so happy eating bread and honey, had heard the maiden screaming when off the blackbird flew, because she thought her pretty nose was bitten quite in two. Well, now that I've told you all this, we'll go back to the forest and peek in through the trees and see what happens there. "Don't make any noise," said the blackbird, "for if that old witch hears us, she'll do something dreadful." So Puss pulled off his boots and tiptoed along. But oh dear me! Every once in a while he'd step on a dry twig, and it would snap like a pistol. "Shh!" cautioned the blackbird. "We are nearing the witch's cottage." And in a few minutes they saw, standing in the doorway of her little log house, the wicked witch. And oh dear me, wasn't she a terrifying-looking person? Her nose crooked down to meet her up-crooked chin, and her wicked black eyes glittered fiercely, and her knotted fingers grasped a crooked staff. "Who comes here?" she called out in a cracked voice. And then the blackbird flew swiftly over and gave her nose a tweak, which made her little black eyes water. "Scat, you evil bird!" she screamed, and she struck at him with her crooked staff, but she never hit him. Oh my, no, for that blackbird was too quick for her. He darted back among the trees where Puss was hiding. "Cowardly bird!" screamed the old witch. "Come near me again, and I will beat you with my staff." And then what do you think our brave little Puss Jr. did? He stepped out from behind the tree and walked toward her. "I am Puss Jr.," he cried, waving his sword, "and many a little character in Mother Goose have I defended. I fear you not." "Oh ho!" cried the witch. "Am I to be flouted by a cat?" And she grasped her staff and ran toward our little hero. "Come no nearer," he commanded, "or I will use my trusty sword. For you are a wicked witch, and I shall show you no mercy." At these words she stopped, glaring fiercely at him. "What would you have?" she asked. "A promise," answered Puss Jr. "You must promise me to steal no more little lambs from the fold, neither to frighten the little robins nor the silver fishes in the stream." "I will not," she shouted, and again she advanced toward Puss Jr. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 11. Read by Olivia.
Chapter 12 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Callie Delmore. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. Puss is bewitched. I was dreadfully sorry to have to stop so suddenly in the last story before I could tell you what happened after the witch threatened little Puss Jr. with her crooked staff. But I didn't have any more room, and anyway, don't you think it's nice to be able to look forward to the next story and to wait for Mother to read it to you? Well, to go on with my story, Puss wasn't frightened the least little bit. No, sir. He just stood there until the witch was close enough to hit him with her staff, and then he climbed up the tree and grinned at her from the branch of her head. "You can't harm me," he said, "for I have a magic plume in my cap, which once belonged to the gingerbread witch, and I have my trusty sword which my famous father Puss in Boots gave me, and I have done nothing wrong. So why should I be afraid?" "And why should I be afraid either?" asked the blackbird, flying up to the branch and sitting close beside our little traveler. "I will make your feathers white," screamed the witch, and then all of a sudden, quicker than a wink, that blackbird became as white as snow. "Now what do you think of my power?" asked the witch with a wicked grin. "I don't care," replied the blackbird, and I suppose now I'll have to call him the whitebird. "White feathers don't hurt, and maybe they are more becoming." And with these words he flew over to the brook and looked at himself in the water. "And now," said the witch, "I'll change you into a squirrel." And she waved her staff at Puss and said, "Presto, change!" And what do you suppose happened? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. Puss just sat there and grinned, and the feather on his cap waved back and forth until the witch grew so angry that she almost flew into a passion, as the storybooks say. And then she changed herself into a fierce wildcat and climbed up the tree after Puss. "Have a care," cried the white bird. "Don't let her bite you." But Puss needed no advice. He jumped nimbly down to the ground and ran into her house and bolted the door, but not until the white bird had flown in through the window, which he closed with his beak after fastening the strong wooden blind. And then wasn't that wildcat witch wild? She was so furious that she scratched and bit the door until she was so tired that she had to lie down and rest. "Let her stay outside all night," said Puss Jr. with a grin, looking at himself in a mirror which hung on the wall. And would you believe me if I told you what he saw? Well, listen, but don't get worried. He saw a squirrel looking at him from the mirror. And in the next story, I'll tell you how Puss regained his former shape. That is, if you can wait until then. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karma Emmings. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. The Escape. Well, you can imagine how surprised Puss was to see what had happened to himself, but he didn't say anything. He just looked in the mirror again and remarked to the white bird, "What do you think of me now? A squirrel with red-topped boots. Why, my own father wouldn't know me." And he began to laugh. "That witch has caused us a lot of trouble," said the white bird, "and if you don't know what he means, you will have to read over the story before this." "How am I ever to change myself back into a cat?" asked Puss, turning the mirror face to the wall, for he didn't like to look at himself any more, and I don't blame him, do you? Without answering, the white bird, flew over to a little cupboard and took out a small bottle of perfume. And on the label was written "Magic Perfume." Then, dipping the tip of his wing into the liquid, he touched Puss Jr., who at once turned into a cat. And of course the white bird turned into a blackbird. And after that, our two little friends looked into the mirror, which Puss turned around the right way, and they were very happy to see their reflections in the glass. "But how are we going to get away?" asked Puss, squinting out of the window. "There's that dreadful wildcat witch waiting for us to open the door." Without answering, the blackbird flew over to the cupboard again and picked up a piece of meat. And then he carefully poured a little of the magic perfume on it and, opening the window just a crack, threw the meat to the wildcat witch, who swallowed it with one bite. And instantly she changed into a little mouse. And before she could run away, Puss darted out through the door and caught her, and with one fierce shake he shook her to death. "Whew!" exclaimed Puss. "Let's get away from here before something else happens." And then he and the blackbird started off through the woods, and by they came to the sheepfold where they had left Mary and her little lamb. But she was nowhere to be seen, so the blackbird said, "We will go to her house, and you can get your good grey horse and continue your journey of adventure." And after Puss had told Mary all about the wicked witch, he mounted his horse and rode away. "Hi-ho," he said to himself after he had gone many miles and the day was drawing to a close. "Hi-ho, I must find a place to sleep, for it will soon be dark." And just then he heard a will-o'-wisp say, "Over the top of yonder hill is a little white cloud that is soft and still. I think it is waiting for me to rest my tired head on its soft white breast." And this made Puss Jr. so sleepy that he closed his eyes and went sound asleep on the back of his good grey horse. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karma Emmings. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. The Cuckoo in the Little Clock House. The cock in the barnyard crows at dawn, to wake the farmer to hoe the corn, and the merry sun hears his early call, and rolls through the sky like a big gold ball. But here in my little clock house on the wall, every hour I carefully call, in a sing-song way, cuckoo, cuckoo, day after day, the whole year through. As the cuckoo finished, from the distant woods was heard the voice of a bird. "Who is calling from the forest?" asked Puss, looking at the cuckoo in the little clock house. "That is the cuckoo of the woods," she replied. "She is a lazy bird. She lets the hours go by with never a thought, while I am a musical reminder of the flight of the hours." And then, who should come in but the farmer, hungry and tired, and when he saw Puss he said, "With whom are you talking?" For the cuckoo had jumped inside her little clock house and closed the door, and of course the farmer wondered why Puss was talking, for he couldn't see anybody around. But when he told the farmer, the good man wouldn't believe that the cuckoo could talk, for he had never heard her say anything but cuckoo. Well, after that, dinner was ready, and the farmer's wife got out a little high chair that belonged to her boy when he was little, and placed it near her, and then she called to Puss, and he jumped up and sat at the table as nice as you please. And after they had finished, Puss took a lump of sugar out to the good grey horse and set off again on his journey. And by he came to a man all dressed in red and white striped trousers, and a blue coat with stars sprinkled all over it. And he was riding on a pony, his whip was made of macaroni, and his cap of feather grey was waving in a manner gay. "Hold on, my good sir," Puss called out. "Pray tell me the name of yonder town." And then Yankee Doodle Dandy, for this was the man's name, pulled up his pony and turned around in his saddle. "Why, it's Puss Junior!" he exclaimed. "Glad to meet you again. Do you remember the day we met, how the man in the moon came down too soon?" "I do indeed," replied Puss, while the good grey horse rubbed noses with the pony. "Where have you been since then?" "Oh, I'm riding around and singing patriotic songs," said Yankee Doodle Dandy. "Would you like to hear one?" And then he began. "Yankee Doodle Doo loves the red and white and blue, the stars upon the deep blue field, the eagle on the battlefield, that flies above the USA and leads the soldiers to the fray." And in our next story, you shall hear the name of the town our two friends were approaching. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 15 All Aboard. The name of the town I promised to tell you in the story before this was Londonderry. But if Yankee Doodle Dandy hadn't told me, I never would have been able to tell you, for Puss didn't ask him again, for by this time they were crossing a bridge, and on a signpost was painted in big red letters, Londonderry. And just then they saw a funny little man with a basket on his arm, and he was singing in a high cracked voice, "To Londonderry to buy a wig, jiggerty, 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 jig, with 6 nice eggs from the busy farm, in the little basket on my arm." And when he saw Puss Junior on his good gray horse, and Yankee Doodle Dandy on his pony, that little old man began to dance, and his hat fell off and showed a very bald head, and the eggs flew out of the basket and broke all over the ground. But still the little man kept on dancing. And now I'll tell you the reason. It was because Yankee Doodle was whistling such a merry tune that nobody could keep still, not even the good gray horse, who began to prance about and stand on his hind legs. And the pony began to dance too, and he and the good gray horse stood up on their hind legs and put their front feet together and waltzed around and around again merry, or something like that. "Please stop whistling," cried little Puss Junior. "If you don't, I'll surely fall off." So good-natured Yankee Doodle Dandy put his hand over his mouth to stop the whistle, and soon everybody grew quiet again. Well, just then a boat came up to the wharf close to the bridge, and the captain called out, "Sir Cat, Sir Cat." "What do you wish?" asked Puss, walking his horse out upon the wharf. "Come take a voyage with me," said the captain. "We are to sail at noon for a foreign shore." "Let us go, little master," whispered the good gray horse. "I have never seen Neptune's horses with their foamy white manes, nor have I ever been to foreign shores." This was enough for Puss, so he gladly accepted the captain's invitation, and in a short time the vessel was upon the deep blue sea with little Puss Junior and his faithful comrade, the good gray horse. Now the captain was a very kind man, and soon he and Puss were the best of friends, and in the evening they sat together, and Puss told the captain all about his adventures, and the captain told Puss all about his, and oh dear me, they had a fine time. And the good gray horse, whenever the wind blew a gale, looked out of the porthole to see the sea-horses, with their flying, foamy manes and tails. And in the next story, you shall hear some more about Puss Jr. on the deep blue sea. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mélanie Lamarche. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Mr. Neptune. One bright morning, as Puss stood on the deck of the ship, he saw a pair of wonderful sea-horses. Behind them they dragged a beautiful pearly boat in which sat a gray-haired man. His long flowing beard reached below his knees, and the wind and the spray from the waves mingled with it, until it was hard to tell whether his beard was not really the long white wake that stretched out from the stern of the boat. And when the good gray horse, who had carried Puss Jr. so long and faithfully on land, looked out of a porthole and saw Neptune's horses, he neighed until they answered him with a shrill cry. All day long they followed the ship, and when evening came they were still in sight. And by, when the stars were out and the moon was bright in the heavens above, Puss Jr. heard Neptune's horses talking to the good gray horse, who had thrust his head out through the porthole in order to hear what they were saying. "Come with us," they pleaded, "for the sea is a beautiful place, and the seaweed meadows are soft and green." But the good gray horse shook his head. "I don't know how to swim as well as you." And then he looked up to the deck and saw little Puss Jr. leaning over the rail. "I have never seen the seaweed meadows," cried our little traveler. "I am in search of adventure. Can you not take my good gray horse and myself in your boat?" And at this the gray-haired man, whose name was Neptune, turned his face toward Puss and spoke in a voice that sounded like the wind in a great sea cave. "Are you the son of Puss in Boots?" "I am, Mr. Neptune," replied Puss. "Oh, please take my good gray horse and me for a ride in your beautiful pearly boat." And then the good gray horse came up on deck and told Puss to get on his back, and then he jumped off the deck right into the water, and in a few minutes he scrambled into the pearly boat. "Now, show your speed," cried Neptune to his seahorses, and away they went, faster than the reindeer of Santa Claus, until they came to a lovely green island where Mr. Neptune lived. And when they were on shore, Mr. Neptune said to Puss Jr., "My daughters will be delighted to see you, for they have often read about you in the Neptune News, and every night they wait eagerly for the Dolphin newsboy to bring it from the Porpoise printer." And after that the seahorses went to their coral stable near the shore, and Puss on his good gray horse followed Mr. Neptune to his wonderful castle, where his 3 lovely mermaid daughters stood waiting to receive them. And in the next story you shall hear more about this wonderful island where Mr. Neptune lived. End of chapter 16. Chapter number 17 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mélanie Lamarche. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Ding Dong Bell. You remember in the last story how Puss Jr. landed on Neptune's island with his good gray horse, and how Mr. Neptune invited him to go to his castle to meet his 3 mermaid daughters. Well, as soon as they reached the castle, the door opened, and there stood the lovely mermaids. And before we go any further, let me say right here that the castle was built in a beautiful green seawater pond so that the mermaids could swim about in the castle. For of course they couldn't walk, you know, for they had tails and not feet, as all real mermaids have. "I don't know exactly how you're going to get along in my castle," said Mr. Neptune thoughtfully. "You can't swim, so what's to be done?" Leave that to us," laughed the three mermaids all in one breath. And do you know, it sounded just like music, for their voices were very soft and sweet. And then they pushed forward a little mother-of-pearl boat for Puss to ride in. "Now, leave the good gray horse out in the meadow," they said, "for the grass is tender and green, and he will have a fine dinner." And pretty soon they went into the dining hall of the castle and had a wonderful feast. And after that Mr. Neptune showed Puss all over the castle until there was nothing more to see. So Puss said he must be going, and Mr. Neptune hitched up his wonderful seahorses to the pearly boat and took Puss and his good gray horse across the water until they came to the mainland. But when they started to get out, the good gray horse said he would like to spend his vacation with Mr. Neptune's seahorses. So Puss said he might, and started off by himself. Now at first it seemed very lonely to be going along without his old comrade, the good gray horse. But Puss had done it before, and after all he was a brave little cat. So on he went, and by he came to a pretty village where the church bell was tolling. Ding dong bell. "What can be the matter?" thought Puss, running up to a crowd of people who stood around an old well on the village common. "Something must have happened." And just then a small boy began crying, "Pussy's in the well!" And in another minute a very wet pussy cat was lifted out of the well and placed carefully on the grass. She lay very still with her eyes closed and her pretty fur all soaked with water. "Who put her in?" Puss asked angrily. "Little Tommy Green," everybody answered at once. "What a naughty boy was that to drown poor Pussy Cat, who never did him any harm but killed the mice in his father's barn," shouted Puss Junior, forgetting in his excitement that he was reciting his favorite Mother Goose rhyme. "You bet he was!" cried little Johnny Stout. "It's lucky I pulled her out. Perhaps she isn't quite dead." "I'm afraid she is," answered Puss Junior. "Still, if she wasn't in the water too long, we may save her. It usually takes a long time to drown the 9 lives of a cat." You see, he knew the old saying that every cat has 9 lives. And then he rolled her over and over on the grass, for he remembered hearing once that this was the proper way to bring a drowning person to life. Pretty soon, poor Pussy Cat gave a faint meow and opened one eye. And after that she stood up with the water trickling down her face and dripping off in little drops from her scraggly tail. "I guess she's all right now," said Puss Junior. "Isn't there some kind little girl who will take her home and cuddle her up nice and warm? Isn't there some little girl who would like a pussy for a pet?" "Oh, let me have her!" cried little Bo Peep. "Since I've lost my sheep, I've been longing for a pet to play with." And then she picked up Pussy in her arms and ran off to her home. "Well, this ought to be a lesson to every boy here to let pussy cats alone," said Puss Junior. "Where is Tommy Green?" And didn't Tommy Green look ashamed when someone pushed him out of the crowd? "You tell your father," said Puss to the naughty boy, "to duck you in the well so you'll know how it feels." And then he curled his whiskers until they stood out like bayonets, for he was very angry. And then he picked up his hat and resumed his journey of adventure. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Mistress Mary's Garden. You remember in the last story how Puss Jr. saved the poor pussy cat, and how he scolded naughty Tommy Green for throwing her in the well. And I hope every little boy, after reading this story, will never, never tease a poor pussy cat. Well, after that, Puss trudged along, and by he met little Bo Peep, and, oh, dear me, she was crying as if her heart would break, for she had lost her sheep, you know, and didn't know where to find them. Well, the first thing Puss Jr. said was, "I'll help you find them," and then he looked around, but there were no sheep anywhere to be seen. And just then Little Boy Blue came by, blowing his horn to call the cows from the fields of corn. So Puss asked him whether he had seen any lost sheep. "The sheep are in the meadow, and the cows are in the corn, and that is why I do not cry but blow my silver horn," replied Little Boy Blue. Then Puss and Little Bo Peep hurried down to the meadow, and there, sure enough, were her sheep. "And now that you have found them," said little Puss Jr., "I must be on my way." And he set off again, and by he came to a garden surrounded by a high wall. So up he climbed and looked over. And what do you think he saw? Why, some silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. And the pretty maids were only dolls, but Mistress Mary thought they were the loveliest things in the world. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow?" asked Puss Jr., and then he jumped down from the wall and made a pretty shell house for one of the dolls to live in. "Oh my, but you're a nice pussy," said Mistress Mary, who really wasn't a bit contrary, you know, and she let him ring one of the little silver bells. And then all of a sudden Puss said, "Meow! I've got a boot full of sand, and it tickles my toes." So of course he had to take it off right then and there, and pour out the sand, and after that he made up a little rhyme, which went something like this, if I remember right, only I may have forgotten one or two lines, for the little bird that told me had only a few minutes to stay on my window sill, and I couldn't make my typewriter go fast enough to write it all down. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary, ring your silver bells, till the roses and the posies and the cockle shells dance upon your garden wall, where the ants and beetles crawl." And then Puss took off his other boot, for that was half full of sand by this time, and turned it upside down until it was empty. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 19 Baby Bunting Bunny. You remember, in the last story, How Puss Junior played with Mistress Mary, quite contrary, in her garden of cockle shells and silver bells. Well, now that the sand was out of his boots, Puss was ready for anything, and when Mary, quite contrary, invited him into the house, he pulled them on in a moment. Perhaps he thought he might get a cookie, or a saucer of cream. I'm sure I don't know. Well, anyway, if he thought this, he said nothing, but followed her across the garden and up on the big porch. And just as she opened the front door, the big grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour. Dickory, dickory, dock, the mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, and down he come, dickory, dickory, dock. But, oh dear me, this was too much for Puss Junior. It made him think of the good old days, when he went mouse hunting. And so he started after him. And just then Mistress Mary's mother walked into the hall, and before Puss could stop, he bumped into her. "Mercy! What's that?" she exclaimed, while Puss blushed and stammered out an excuse. "I'm very sorry, but I didn't see you," he said. "Don't feel badly about it," answered Mistress Mary's mother. Then she looked at our little traveler and laughed. "Why, it's Puss in Boots." "You have guessed nearly right," he answered. "I'm his son, Puss Junior. I am seeking adventures, and am traveling through Mother Goose Land to meet all the little people who live there." And then our little traveler began to recite this little poem. "Oh, I'm the son of Puss in Boots, and I have traveled far. I've seen the merry man in the moon, and the twinkle, twinkle star. And some day I shall write a book of the wonderful things I've seen. That is, when I've been through Fairyland and met the Fairy Queen." And this so delighted Mistress Mary that she took from her little finger a gold ring and gave it to him. "For," she said, "you are a poet, Sir Puss, and I want you to wear my ring to remember me by." Well, after that, Puss said good-bye and continued on his way. And by, he came to a queer little house by the roadside, where lived a little rabbit. And when Puss knocked on the door, who should open it but the Baby Bunting bunny. "Baby Bunting's father may be a good hunter," said the little rabbit, as Puss sat down on the porch to have a talk, "but he didn't catch me. He didn't get my furry skin to wrap his baby bunting in." "How was that?" asked Puss. "Didn't he have a gun?" "He did," answered the little rabbit, and then he winked his eye, but I was too quick for him, only the bullet took off the tip of my tail. And then he told Puss all about it, and I would tell it to you, only there's no more room in this story. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. 3 Blind Mice. One day, as Puss Jr. was trudging along a pretty road, on either side of which were fields of clover, he came to a shady lane leading to an old farmhouse. And just as he was about to open the gate, an old woman came running toward him. Her gray hair was flying in the wind, and the strings of her bonnet streamed out behind her like the tail of a kite. And close at her heels scampered 3 little mice. 3 blind mice. See how they run, chirped a robin in the apple tree. They all ran after the farmer's wife, yelped a little yellow dog, who cut off their tails with a carving knife, mooed a big white cow, looking curiously over the old rail fence that bordered the shady lane. Did you ever see such a sight in your life? Inquired a little black hen, and she flew up on the rail close to the good-natured cow. No, I never did, replied Puss Jr. But oh dear me, just then the old woman turned and cut off the tails of the 3 little mice with a great big slash of her carving knife. Squeak, 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 cried the 3 little mice one after another. Oh dear, cried Puss. If you had only arrived a little sooner, said the farmer's wife, picking up the 3 little tails, you might have saved me all this trouble. I've told these pesky mice over and over again if they didn't stop eating my nut cake, I'd cut off their tails. But they wouldn't believe me, and now they've had the impertinence to chase me out of my own house. So I've just gone and done it. And then she waved the 3 little tails at the 3 little mice who were huddled together in a corner of the old rail fence. But how could I have helped you? Asked Puss Jr. All little animals are my friends, and I never harm anyone unless he first harms me. You see, he added, dusting off the red tops of his boots and clapping his hand upon his sword, I'm a traveler in search of adventure, and my father is the famous Puss in Boots. Well, I declare, exclaimed the old woman. And just then the 3 little mice came forward, and the largest one ran up to Puss and said, Dear Mr. Puss Jr., what you have just said makes my brothers and myself feel that you are a friend. Won't you please ask the old woman to give us back our tails? Will you? Asked Puss Jr., turning to the farmer's wife. If they'll promise to let my cake alone, she replied. Indeed we will, cried the 3 little mice all at once. So she handed them their tails, and they scampered away. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carrie Arnold. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Little Black Hen. I wonder where I'll go now, said Puss Jr., as the farmer's wife, who had just cut off the tails of the 3 little mice, returned to the house without even so much as bidding him good-bye. Come with me, said the little black hen. What for? asked Puss doubtfully. What for? said the Mooly Cow. Why, she's the hickety-pickety, my black hen. She lays good eggs for gentlemen. Gentlemen come every day to see what my black hen doth lay. Indeed, said Puss, of course I will. And then the little black hen jumped off the fence rail and, giving a contented cluck-cluck, strutted across the field. The good-natured Mooly Cow and Puss followed. She's a wonderful little thing, confided the cow to Puss, as they neared a big red barn, on one side of which stood a great haystack, and on the other a well-filled corn crib. You should see the fine gentlemen who drive up every morning to get one of her nice fresh eggs. Now I'm going into the barn, said the little black hen, and when I cackle 3 times, I'll have something to show you. So Puss Jr. and the cow sat down on the milking stool and waited, and after a while, just as the little black hen said, "Cackle, cackle, cackle," a big automobile dashed into the backyard. "Honk, honk!" screamed the bright brass horn. "Look out!" yelled Puss Jr., scrambling off the milking stool. But the good-natured Muley Cow didn't even move. She sat perfectly still and chewed her cud, for she wasn't afraid of automobiles, even if she never had ridden in one. "Well, I declare," exclaimed one of the gentlemen as he got out of the car. "Here's a fine pussycat booted and spurred, and a Muley Cow sitting upon a milking stool." And just then the little black hen came out of the barn and commenced to cackle at a great rate. "Come in," she said, "and see my nest full of lovely white eggs." So the two fine gentlemen and Puss Jr. followed her into the barn, and there, right close to the Muley Cow's stall, was a little round nest. But the good-natured Muley Cow didn't get off the milking stool. She just sat there chewing her cud in a most contented way. "I can't let you have more than 2 eggs today," said the little black hen, "for I'm going to give Puss Jr. one, and that will leave only the china egg in the nest." And after that she sang this little song: "Every day an egg I lay, I'm a thrifty hen, but if you must take 2, please don't come again." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carrie Arnold. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. My Dame Has Lost Her Shoe. You remember in the last story that the little black hen had just laid an egg for the gentleman. Well, after that, the big red rooster strutted around the corner of the barn and commenced to crow. "Cock-a-doodle-doo! My dame has lost her shoe." "Dear me," said Puss Jr., "I'm very sorry." "So are we," said the two fine gentlemen in the same breath, as they carefully placed the 2 little white eggs in a basket and stowed it away on the back seat of the automobile. "It seems to me I noticed a lady's shoe by the roadway just before I turned into the lane," said Puss Jr. "I think it had a silver buckle on it." "That's it," shouted the red rooster, and just then the farmer's wife came out of the house. "Ask her," said the little black hen. "I don't remember whether she had a silver buckle on her shoe, but if the big red rooster does, why, it must be so, for he knows everything." And this so pleased the big red rooster that he turned a somersault and sang the Star-Spangled Banner over 3 times. "Did your shoe have a silver buckle on it?" asked Puss of the farmer's wife, who, you remember, in 2 or 3 stories ago, cut off the tails of the 3 little mice. "Yes, but what's that got to do with you?" she answered crossly. "Isn't it bad enough to lose a shoe without being asked if it had a silver buckle on it?" "Get into the automobile, my good woman," said one of the fine gentlemen, "and we'll take you down the road, and maybe we'll find the pretty shoe, with the buckle on it, too." So the farmer's wife climbed into the car. "Honk, honk," went the big brass horn. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," crowed the rooster. "Cluck, cluck," went the little black hen, but the big good-natured Muley Cow never said a word. She just sat on the milking stool and chewed her cud. "I'm glad I don't wear shoes," said the little black hen, as the automobile disappeared down the shady lane. "I like my little yellow toes just the way they are." "Boots are very handy on a long journey," said Puss Jr. "I don't know what I should have done without mine." "Well, I have no time for travel," replied the little black hen, and after that the automobile returned with the farmer's wife, who began to sing. "Well, I have found my shoe, Mr. Cock-a-doodle-doo, and the silver buckle, too." And then she thanked Puss Jr. for having told her that he had seen it by the roadside. And after that he said goodbye and resumed his journey of adventure. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Carrie Arnold. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. The Duck Ferry Boat. One morning, Puss Jr. awoke to find himself under a spreading chestnut tree. He had forgotten that he had fallen asleep the night before, and that the owl, who owned this beautiful big tree, had invited him to sleep beneath its friendly shade. Puss rubbed his eyes and looked about him. The golden rays of the morning sun, as they gleamed through the open spaces, made him blink and wink, so that he hardly noticed the ferns and wild flowers smiling under the touch of the merry sunshine. "Hey ho!" yawned Puss. "I must be up and on my way, for a traveler must never be lazy." "Bravely said," tooted the owl, who owned the tree, and he flew down from his house in a big hollow limb and handed our small traveler a saucer of cream for breakfast. And as soon as Puss had drunk it, he said good-bye and went upon his way, and by he came to a great big pond. But how was he to get across, for there was no boat in sight, and he didn't want to swim with big boots on his feet, and of course he wouldn't leave his boots behind him? And while he sat there wondering what to do, a big white duck swam up to the bank. "Oh, duck, dear duck, see here I stand, my trusty sword held in my hand. I wish to cross this water wide, upon your back, pray let me ride." "Get aboard," said the duck. "I'm just as good as a ferry boat." So Puss Jr. sprang nimbly on her back, and away they went over the water. "Your feet are just as good as paddles," said Puss, "and you're painted white. I mean, you are white, just like the last ferry boat I was on." "Well, I'm glad you're satisfied," said the duck, and she made her feet go so fast that in a few minutes they were at the opposite shore. "Take this," said Puss, and he handed the duck a bright penny. "This was given to me by a little boy some time ago, and I've kept it ever since. But you take it, for you've been very kind." "That's just what I want," said the duck. "You see, I'm teaching my little ducks how to dive. Now, when I get home, I'll throw it in the water, and they can dive for it, and whoever gets it first can buy a stick of candy." "Well, well," laughed Puss, "that's a good idea. Here's another penny. It isn't as bright as that one, but it will do in case you lose the first one." "By the way, my little friend," said the duck, as Puss started to go upon his way, "where do you expect to find lodgings when evening comes?" "I'm sure I don't know," answered Puss, "but a wise traveler never crosses his bridge till he comes to it." And Puss winked as he repeated this saying, which you have probably heard. "About a day's journey from here," continued the duck, "lives a cousin of mine, the golden goose. Tell him you know me, and all will go well with you." And with these words the duck swam away. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 24 The Golden Goose. Well, after Puss Jr. left the pond over which the white duck had so kindly carried him, our little traveler came to a forest, where sat a golden goose upon a log. "Pray excuse me if I don't shake hands with you," said the beautiful bird, rising and flapping her golden wings. "But the truth is, whoever touches me can never withdraw his hand." "What?" exclaimed Puss Jr., surprised. "Most certainly," answered the golden goose. "Did you never read the fairy tale of the little boy who cut down a tree and found me at the roots?" "Oh, I remember now," said Puss, "though it is a long time since I read the story." And if any little boy or girl doesn't know this story, if he'll write me a letter, I'll tell him where he can find it. "But where are you going?" inquired the beautiful golden goose, as she preened her feathers with her smooth yellow bill. "Oh, I'm just in search of adventure," replied our little hero, and he flicked the dust off his red-topped boots and clapped his right paw upon his trusty sword. "I'm a traveler." And just then a little old gray-haired man appeared, and so startled the golden goose that she fell off the log. "Fear me not," said the little man, "for was it not I who told the little boy to cut down the tree and release you from your wooden prison?" And this made the golden goose feel more comfortable, and she scrambled back upon the log and nestled up close to little Puss Junior. "But whom have we here?" asked the little old man, looking at Puss with a kindly smile. "Puss in Boots, Junior," replied our little hero with a bow. "You look like your father," said the little gray man. "He had the finest whiskers I ever saw on a cat, and yours are just like his." And of course this pleased Puss Junior immensely. "But come," continued the little gray man, "night will soon be here. I can offer you a night's lodging and a good supper, for he who travels hard by day must eat and sleep by night." And with these words the little old man arose and led our two small friends into the forest, and by they came to a small hut. "He is a good man and will not harm you," whispered the golden goose. And then the three entered the doorway. "I have but little to offer," said the old gray man, "but such as I have you are welcome to." And after a little while he made some broth, and with a loaf of black bread they had a hearty supper. And then they sat around the fire, and the little old man told them stories of elves and witches and red stars and pink moons, until little Puss Junior fell sound asleep, and never woke up until the sun was shining through the treetops of the big forest. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Little Gray Man. You remember, in the last story, how Puss Jr. went to sleep in the hut of the Little Gray Man of the wood. Well, after he had dreamed of pink moons and red stars and green-eyed witches and black cats, he was awakened by the golden goose saying, "Wake up, little pussy, the sun's in the sky, he's winking at you with his bright golden eye. So hurry and dress, as the little cat should, and soon you'll be off on your way through the wood." And in a short time Puss was dressed and ready for his journey. "I have a favor to ask of you," said the little gray man, and he handed our small traveler a package. "What is the favor?" asked Puss. "Before I promise I must know what I am to do, lest, in complying too readily with your request, I repent at leisure." "Never fear," replied the little gray man. "It is an easy task. Near by stands a stately castle, in which live a king and queen. For many years they have wished for a child, and now, at last, fortune has smiled upon them, and the queen is the mother of a lovely baby girl. Today is the christening. All the fairies have been asked to the feast, and they will bring with them many gifts. Now, my dear Puss, I am an old, old man, and I am not able to attend this grand affair. But, nevertheless, I would send a present. May I ask you to be the bearer of my gift?" So Puss set out with the little package, and by he came to the stately castle, where the little baby was to be christened in sight of courtly lords and ladies and the fairies of the wood. And when the king and queen saw Puss, they rose from their throne and said, "Ah, here comes the son of the famous Puss in Boots, for never have we seen a cat with red-top boots since the time his illustrious parent paid us a visit." And after that Puss Junior was led up to the throne by two pages. "Welcome, Puss Junior," cried the lovely queen. "Welcome, Sir Cat," cried the king, and he shook our little hero by the paw. "I have a gift from the little gray man of the wood," said Puss, "and I am instructed by him to lay it at the foot of the baby princess." So Puss was led up to the royal cradle, where he carefully set down the gift which the little gray man had entrusted to his care. And when the package was opened, what do you think was found inside? Why, a beautiful pair of pearl earrings, and on a card was written, "She who wears these rings of pearl Ne'er shall fear an evil churl. Noble knight shall win her hand, make her queen of all the land." "Ah," said the king, "this is a magic gift!" And he smiled at Puss, who felt very proud to have been the bearer of the little gray man's present. And after that he went upon his way, hoping for a new adventure, which would turn out as well as this one. End of chapter 25. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 25, 2023. Chapter 26 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Water Sprite. One morning, as Puss Jr. came to the edge of a little winding brook, he heard a silvery voice exclaim, "Who looks within these waters bright, that gleam like silver stars at night, will ever after think of me, the spirit of these waters free?" And then the loveliest water sprite came out of the brook and waved her silver wand over a yellow buttercup, which immediately turned into a golden throne. And after the lovely water sprite had seated herself upon it, she turned again to Puss Jr. and said, "Whither goest thou, Sir Cat?" "I am seeking my fortune," he replied. "Have you searched for the pot of gold that hangs on a rainbow?" she asked. "I once slid down a rainbow," replied Puss, with a grin, "but the only thing I found at the end of it was a big haystack." "Well, maybe that was better than a pot of gold," said the little water sprite, "for it no doubt saved your life." "Well, the next time I see a rainbow I shall look for the pot of gold," said Puss Jr., and after that he took off his hat and bowed to the fairy water sprite and continued his journey of adventure. And by he came to a little house in the woods, so he peeked into the window to see what was inside, for the door was closed and he thought it better not to knock, for he didn't know who might open the door, you know. And while he was looking in, a little dog ran up and opened the door without even so much as a knock. Now, inside was a lovely pussy cat, sitting by the fire, and Puss was just going to tap on the window pane when the little dog opened the door. Pussy sits by the fire, warming all her fur. In comes the little dog just to worry her. So, Mistress Pussy, pray how do you do?" Thank you, little dog, much better without you." But the little dog began to bark, so Puss boldly opened the door and said, "Don't you dare bark at Mistress Pussy Cat." And then he drew his sword, and he looked so fierce that the little dog ran out of the house and far away, and he never stopped till the end of the day. And in the next story you shall hear some more about Puss Jr. and his adventures. End of chapter 26. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 25, 2023. Chapter 27 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Miser. You remember, in the last story, that Puss had frightened away the little dog that was barking at Mistress Pussy. Well, after that, Puss Jr. was a hero in her eyes. She thought he was the bravest cat she had ever met, and she gave him a little gold ring. And then Puss told her he was searching for his fortune, and that a lovely water sprite had told him to find the pot of gold that hung on the end of the rainbow. "Well, I can tell you where there is more gold than you will ever find in a pot," said Mistress Pussy, and then she told Puss about an old miser who lived in an old stone castle not very far away. "But he won't give me any of his gold," said Puss. "People don't give away money like that, and he's a miser, too." "I will tell you a secret," said the little pussy cat. "His castle is overrun with rats and mice, and if you can find a way to get rid of them, I'm sure he'll give you a handsome reward." "Well, it's worth trying," said Puss Jr. So he said good-bye and started off for the miser's castle, and by he came to the big front gate, on which he knocked with the hilt of his sword. And after a while it was opened, just a little, and a thin, cracked voice asked who dared to knock so boldly. "Puss in Boots, Jr.," replied our small traveler. "Oh ho!" said the voice. "A cat, eh? Well, that gives me an idea." And then the gate opened wider and Puss saw the old miser. And, oh, dear me, wasn't he a dreadful-looking person? His clothes were all tattered and torn, and his hair was long and his beard unshorn. "If I let you come in," he said, "you must first promise me one thing." "And if I come in, you must promise me one thing," answered Puss Jr., as boldly as a robber. And this made the miser stop to think, for he was afraid that Puss might ask him for some money, and that was the last thing he would part with. Yes, indeed, for he was the miserliest old miser in all Mother Goose Land, but he was also very wise, so he didn't reply to Puss Jr.'s remark, but said, "If I let you in, you must promise to rid the castle of all the rats and the mice that eat my cheese and spice." "I will do that if you will pay me well," replied Puss, "for I must have money, and you have plenty." But, oh, dear me, when the old miser heard that, he almost shut the gate. But after he had thought a moment, he said, "Come in, and I will pay you well if you rid me of these pesky rats and mice." This is what he said to Puss, but what he thought to himself was that he would let Puss do all this for him, and then throw him out of the castle without paying him anything. End of chapter 27, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 25, 2023. Chapter 28 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. 2 bags of gold. You remember in the last story how the miserly old miser was going to let Puss kill all the rats and the mice that lived in the castle, and then not give him a cent for doing it. Well, before we go any further, I'll tell you right here that I won't let that mean old miser play any such trick on little Puss Jr. No, indeed. Not if I have to buy 1,000 traps and send them up to the old miser and make him pay for them and Puss Jr. besides. Well, come in, said the miser, and he led Puss into the old broken-down castle. And just then a big rat darted across the floor, and a little mouse peeped out of her hole, and this made the old miser very angry. "That's the rat that gnawed the string to one of my money bags," he said, "and that's the little mouse that ate my bread and cheese." And then that miserly old miser grew even more angry. "Well, before I begin," said Puss, "I want you to promise to give me 2 bags of gold if I rid your castle of all the rats and the mice." "Agreed," said the mean old miser, although he didn't mean to keep his promise at all, you know. So Puss took off his coat and his red-top boots and his pink waistcoat and his hat with a big waving plume, and then he got down on his 4 paws and crept softly out of the room. "Ha ha!" said the old miser, "I'll soon be rid of all the rats and the mice without it costing me a penny." And he rubbed his hands together, and then he sat down and waited. Well, he didn't have to wait very long before Puss came back and said, "There is not a rat nor a mouse left in your castle, not even the baby mice. So give me the money that I may be on my merry way." But the mean old miser began to laugh loudly, and then he said, "What have you done with them all?" So Puss took him over to the window and showed him all the rats and the mice marching away. "There they go," said Puss, "and they'll never come back." "Well, you follow after them," said the wicked old miser, and he tried to push Puss out of the window. And this made Puss Jr. so angry that he gave 3 loud whistles, and back came all the rats and the mice as fast as they could. And when the old miser saw that, he brought out 2 bags of gold and gave them to Puss. "Now tell the rats and the mice to get out," he said in a cross voice. So Puss took the bags of gold and went out of the castle, and all the rats and the mice followed after, and by They came to another old castle where a kind lord lived who didn't have any money. So Puss gave him a bag of gold for his castle, and then Puss turned the castle over to the rats and the mice to live in for ever and ever, and the kind lord went to London to live, and Puss went on his way to seek more adventures. End of chapter 28, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 25, 2023.
Chapter 29 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 29. Half a Bag of Gold. You remember in the last story how Puss left the castle of the old miser with 2 bags of gold under his arm, and how he bought with one of them a castle for the rats and mice to live in for the rest of their days. Well, after that, he went upon his way with the remaining bag of gold under his arm, and by he came to a poor woodcutter's hut in the middle of the forest. And when he knocked at the door, it was opened by the woodcutter's wife, who was crying bitterly, for her good man was ill, and she had no money to pay for a doctor. So, generous little Puss Jr. opened his bag of gold and gave her half, and the rest he put in his pockets. And then he said good-bye and went upon his way. And by he came across Little Red Riding Hood, and, oh dear me, wasn't she frightened, for a wicked wolf had scared her poor old grandma nearly to death, and had run off with her big fat goose. And now we'll have no Christmas dinner, sobbed Little Red Riding Hood, and this made Puss feel so badly that he gave her 5 gold pieces. Wasn't that generous in him? And if he keeps on, he'll have to find another fortune, for he won't have a penny left, with that dear little generous pussy-cat. "Hi-ho," said Puss to himself, "I wonder what will happen next." And then all of a sudden an old owl commenced to toot, so Puss stopped and asked him what time it was, and the wise old bird put his claw in his pocket and tooted again. "I forgot to wind my watch last night, and I didn't wake up this morning in time to ask a robin, you see, for I was sleepy and yawning." "Oh dear," said Puss, "what shall I do?" "Don't worry," said the kind old owl, "you can sleep in my nest. There's room for 2. So Puss took off his boots and climbed up the tree, and he nearly dropped one of them, for it wasn't easy to hold them between his teeth, let me tell you. Well, when he got inside of Mr. Owl's house, he found it a very nice sort of place, for Mrs. Owl kept it neat and clean, and when the next morning came, Puss gave them a gold piece and climbed down the tree and set off once more upon his journey of adventure. And by he came to a little house, so he peeked through the open window. "What are you doing, my little men?" asked Puss Jr. "Making coats for gentlemen," replied 6 little mice, who were seated around a table, busily sewing. "Shall I come in and bite off their threads?" asked Puss with a grin. "No, Puss Jr. You might bite off our heads." And before he could say a word, they scampered away. Wasn't that too bad, for Puss never would have harmed them? And besides, I wonder what the gentlemen will say when they don't get their coats on time? Perhaps they will give these 6 little tailor mice a dreadful scolding. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 30. Another Pussycat Lady. You remember in the last story how Puss frightened the 6 little tailor mice? Well, after that he went down the road, and after a little while he met another pussycat who carried a green parasol over her head and a pretty vanity bag in her left paw. So Puss bowed very politely, and then she asked him to walk with her and talk with her, for she was lonely, don't you see, and longed for someone's company. So Puss told her how he had frightened the tailor mice, and this made her laugh. "I did something like that myself," she said. "I went to London to see the Queen, and while I was there I frightened a little mouse under a chair." "Tell me about it," said Puss. "I have never seen the Queen." So the Pussy-cat commenced. "When I reached Buckingham Palace, I was shown into a magnificent room, and just as I heard the Queen coming down the stairs, a little mouse ran across the room, and oh dear me, I forgot all about my manners, and went after that mouse, and the first thing I knew, I was out of the front door, and the big tall footman wouldn't let me in again, so I never met the Queen." "Wasn't that too bad?" "And you didn't even catch the mouse?" asked Puss with a grin. No, said the pussy cat, and then she said good-bye to our little traveler, who once more set out upon the road in search of adventure. And toward evening in came sight of a little cottage, and the cheerful light in the kitchen window made Puss hope that he would find supper and lodging for the night. But no one answered his knock, so he pushed open the door and walked in. And just then a motherly-looking woman came down the stairs and said, "Dibble, dibble, dumpling, my son John went to bed with his breeches on. One stocking off and one stocking on, dibble, dibble, dumpling, my son John." And after that there was a great noise overhead, and pretty soon a small boy came tumbling down the stairs, and when he saw Puss he wanted to play with him right away. But I have no time to play with boys who go to bed with their breeches on, and one stocking off and one stocking on, said Puss Jr. And he picked up his cap and was about to leave, although it was dark outside, for he didn't like naughty boys any more than you and I do. "Please don't go," said John's mother, and she gave Puss a saucer of cream, and after that she turned to her naughty son and said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Do you know who this is? Why, he's the son of Puss in Boots." And this made John dreadfully ashamed of himself, and he ran upstairs to bed and went to sleep right away, with both his stockings off and his breeches too. But if Puss hadn't been there, perhaps that naughty boy would have given his poor mother lots of trouble. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 31. Simple Simon. One morning, as Puss Jr. was trampling along a country road, he met Simple Simon going to the fair. I guess everybody was going to the fair that beautiful morning, for the road was crowded with wagons and carriages of all sorts. There were farm wagons full of merry boys and girls, and buggies with old people in old-fashioned clothes, and high carts with gaily dressed ladies, and men in red coats, and oh, dear me, how dusty it was. But Puss didn't mind that, for he was used to traveling, and a good traveler doesn't complain. Well, he and Simple Simon had nearly reached the fair grounds, when a man with a big tray of delicious pastry came up. "Pies, pies," he cried, and when Puss Jr. and Simple Simon looked at them, they felt very hungry. "Oh my, yes," said Simple Simon to the pieman. "Let me taste your ware." Said the pieman to Simple Simon, "Show me your first penny." Said Simple Simon to the pieman, "Sir, I haven't any." "But I have," cried little Puss Jr., and he took a gold piece out of his pocket, and after that they both had all the pie they could eat. And when they had finished, Puss said, "Is there any custard on my whiskers?" For he had eaten custard pie, and apple pie, and peach pie, and plum pie, and lemon pie, and so had Simple Simon. And then Simple Simon said, "Is there any on mine?" which made Puss laugh, for Simon didn't have a single whisker, for he was only a boy, you know. "You've got a big smear of raspberry on your chin," said Puss Jr., and after that they went into the fair grounds and looked at all the funny sights, the fat woman and the thin man, the giant and the dwarf, and the dreadful skeleton man, and a two-headed cow, and all the other queer sights. And when there was nothing more to see, Puss said good-bye to Simple Simon and went on his way, and by he came to a hill, and just then, all of a sudden, down the hill came Jack and Jill, and the pail of water after. Said Jill to Jack, "Alas, alack, and there is no time for laughter." And oh dear me, Puss Jr. was spattered all over, and the red tops of his boots were wet, and some of the water got inside and made his toes damp. And you know how a cat hates water, and if the sun hadn't been shining brightly in the day, I don't believe Puss would have got dry for a long time. Well, after that, he left the road and climbed over a fence into a meadow, and there he met Old Mother Hubbard's dog, who was burying a bone in the ground for dinner the next day. And in the next story, you shall hear what he said to little Puss Jr. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Chapter 32. Old Mother Hubbard. You remember in the last story I promised to tell you what Old Mother Hubbard's dog said to Puss Jr.? Well, the first thing he did was to invite Puss to take a look at the old lady's cupboard. "Perhaps you can find something to eat there." And the old dog laughed and wagged his tail, and then he covered up the bone, which he had placed in a hole in the ground, and told Puss to follow him. And by they came to Old Mother Hubbard's cottage, and after they had gone in they looked around, but the old lady was nowhere to be seen. But in a few minutes they heard her coming up the garden walk. "I'm going to make believe I'm starved," said the naughty old dog, and he rolled over on the floor and lay very still. Oh dear," cried Old Mother Hubbard. "Here, I've gone to the baker to get him some bread, and when I get back my poor dog is dead." And then she began to cry, and all this time she hadn't seen Puss, for her eyes were full of tears, and she kept wiping them with her handkerchief. And after that she went out again and closed the door. "How can you be so deceitful?" asked Puss. "I never thought she'd suppose I'd die as easily as all that," said the old dog, and he looked ashamed of himself. And I think he should have, for it wasn't very nice to fool an old lady, for it wasn't her fault that her cupboard was bare, for she was dreadfully poor, you know. By and by she returned, and when she saw her dog sitting up and laughing, she said, "Here, I've gone out to buy him a coffin, and when I get back I find him a-laughing." And then she patted him on the head. "I don't believe you're hungry after all," she said. "Let me lend you a gold piece," said little Puss Jr., coming out from behind a chair. "It is part of my fortune." And he handed Old Mother Hubbard a sovereign. "Mercy me, is this Puss in Boots?" exclaimed the old lady, "or is it his son?" "Puss Jr., at your service," and our little traveler bowed very low. "Thank you," said Old Mother Hubbard. "Now, you two make yourselves comfortable while I go to the butcher." And she straightened her bonnet and went out. And then the old dog took out his pipe and smoked it, and Puss took off his red-top boots and sat by the fire. And after a while the kind old lady returned, and when she saw what her dog was doing, she cried, "I've gone to the butcher to buy some fresh tripe, and when I get back you are smoking a pipe." "He's a wonderful dog," she continued, as she set the supper table. "It was only last week I went to the tailor to buy him a coat, and when I got back he was riding the goat." And after supper the dame made a courtesy, the dog made a bow, and Puss in Boots Jr. said good-bye, meow. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Bad Black Spider. One morning, as Puss Jr. was wending his way through a pleasant meadow, he heard the blast of a horn, and the next moment a herd of cows ran out of the cornfield across the road. "I wonder who blew that horn," thought Puss as he walked over to the haystack, where he found a little boy dressed in blue fast asleep. But he wasn't really asleep, for he laughed as Puss tiptoed by and said, "I'm Little Boy Blue who blows his horn to bring the cows from the field of corn." And then he blew again on his silver horn. "I thought you were asleep," said Puss. "I was," said Boy Blue, "till I woke up." And he laughed again and blew on his horn as loud as a rooster that crows at dawn. And then from the meadow came his sheep, and little Puss Jr., to take a peep. There, my typewriter is gone and made a poem and written it all wrong. Isn't that too bad? And just then, all of a sudden, little Miss Muffet came running across the dewy grass, for it was still early morning, you know. "Oh, little Miss Muffet, where is your tuffet?" asked Puss Jr. "Oh, a naughty big spider just sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away," sang Little Boy Blue. But the little girl never stopped. She kept on running until she looked like a little butterfly at the other end of the meadow. And then the big black spider, who sat down beside her, crawled up and said, "If you are fond of curds and whey, you'll find enough to eat today, for little Miss Muffet has left by her tuffet a bowlful upon a tin tray." "You're a bad spider," said Puss. "Yes, you're a mean insect," said Little Boy Blue. And this made the spider so ashamed of himself that he went back and spun a web and crawled up on one end and never came out again. And after that Puss went upon his way, for he was bent on finding another fortune, for he had almost spent his last sovereign, and by, he came to a pretty cottage where stood a little girl singing, "Oh, dear, what can the matter be? Johnny's so long at the fair." "Did he promise to bring you a pair of blue ribbons to tie up your bonny brown hair?" asked Puss, repeating his Mother Goose as well as you and I, and maybe a little better. "Yes, he did," replied the little girl, with a pout. "Did you see him?" "I met Simple Simon and the pieman going to the fair," replied our little traveler, "but I never saw Johnny." And then, all of a sudden, they heard someone whistling, and Johnny came running up with a pair of blue ribbons in his hand. End of chapter 33. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 23, 2023. Chapter 34 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Pea Green Boat. One morning, as Puss Jr. proceeded on his journey of adventure, he came to a blacksmith shop, where a small boy stood outside with his hobby horse. It was a very pretty hobby horse, for at the end of the pole were fastened red and yellow wheels, and, as one of them had come off, the little rider was at a loss to know what to do. So he said to the kind blacksmith, "Robert Barnes, my fellow fine, can you shoe this horse of mine?" And then the blacksmith answered, "Yes, good sir, that I can, as well as any other man. There's a nail and there's a prod, and now, good sir, your horse is shod." And this so pleased the little boy that he turned to Puss Jr. and said, "Would you like to ride my hobby horse?" And this made the good-natured blacksmith smile, and after he had blown up his fire till the sparks flew all about like stars, he said, "I will hold the horse, Sir Cat, while you mount." So Puss got on, saying to the little boy, with a grin which showed all his nice white teeth, and made his whiskers stand out like a cavalryman's, "Do you think he will balk?" "Oh, no," said the little boy, "he's a very gentle horsie." Well, sir, Puss knew how to ride that hobby horse just as well as he did his good gray steed, and he pranced up and down the sidewalk till he was tired out, and then he said good-bye and started off again, for a traveler may not tarry long in one place, you know, and Puss was bent on finding new adventures, as well as a fortune. And by, after he had gone for many a mile, he came to the seashore. "Jump into my boat," said the owner, who was a little owl. The owl and the pussy-cat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. "Take the tiller," said the winky-blinky bird, for the sunlight hurt his eyes dreadfully, you know. So Puss steered the pea-green boat, while the owl put on a pair of green spectacles. And then, pretty soon, the wind blew harder and harder, and the waves dashed higher and higher, and it was mighty hard work guiding the pea-green boat, and Puss began to fear a shipwreck. Suddenly, "Ship ahoy!" sounded across the water, and a small round object appeared in the distance. So Puss headed the pea-green boat toward it, and pretty soon they saw 3 men in a bowl. "3 wise men of Gotham, they went to sea in a bowl," said the owl, "but I don't think much of their wisdom, for the bowl looks cracked to me." "Help! Help!" cried the 3 wise men, and if Puss hadn't come up close enough so that they could scramble into the pea-green boat, I guess they would all have been drowned, for just then, all of a sudden, down went the old cracked bowl to the bottom of the deep blue sea, where a mermaid found it and filled it full of seashells. "That was a lucky escape!" cried one of the 3 wise men, and then they all began to sing, "Oh, the old cracked bowl is resting on a shoal at the bottom of the deep blue ocean, and we never more will sail in a bowl or in a pail, for a cracked bowl cannot stand the awful motion." And after that, Puss turned the pea-green boat toward the town of Gotham, and landed the 3 wise men on the wharf. And then he set sail again, for he didn't want to stay in a town where the wise men went to sea in such a nonsensical craft as a cracked bowl. "If their bowl had been stronger, they might have sailed longer," laughed Puss. But the wise little owl said nothing, for he was looking across the sea where a big whale was spouting water high up into the air. "Don't get too near that old whale," said the owl, "for we don't want to get a shower bath." So Puss steered the boat in another direction, and by, a school of dolphins came by, turning over and over in the water like cartwheels. And the first thing he knew, one of them hit the pea green boat a dreadful blow and made a big crack in it. Well, if Puss hadn't been a fine sailor, he never would have reached land. But he did, and then he left the owl to mend the boat and started off on his journey. End of chapter 34. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 23, 2023. Chapter 35 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Puss meets an old friend. One bright morning, as Puss Jr. was wending his way down a pleasant valley, whom should he run across but Goosey Gander? "You have come just in time," said our little traveler, "for my legs are tired. Carry me on your good strong back and fly away with me." And the gander was very obliging. He took Puss Jr. on his back, and by, they came to an old barnyard, and just then a cat came singing out of a barn, a pair of bagpipes under her arm. She sang nothing but fiddle-dee-dee, worried a mouse and a bumblebee. Puss began purring, Mouse ran away, and off the bee flew with a loud huzzah. "You play very badly, Miss Pussy," said our little traveler, "or was it your purr that frightened the little mouse and the bee?" But the little Scotch pussy-cat did not answer her. She shouldered her bagpipes and marched off. And after that, Puss Jr. ran up to the bumblebee and asked him for some honey. "Why don't you make your own honey?" buzzed the bee crossly. "I'm tired of making honey and not getting any money for it." And I don't blame him either, do you? For it isn't very nice to work all summer to fill a beehive with honey, and then have some big man come around and take it away. "Oh, well," said Puss, "fly away then to your flowers." And he turned around and went back to Goosey Gander. And the kind old gander said, "Get on my back again and we'll fly away, for what is the use of staying here?" So off they flew across the sky so bright and blue, and after a while they came to a stile that was not nearly as high as the bright blue sky. And who do you suppose was leaning on the stile? Why, little Jack Horner, who had left his corner because his thumb wouldn't pull out a plum. And of course he was very cross. Oh, dear me, yes, he was as cross as two sticks, as the grown-ups say, and that means a great deal. "I'll tell Mother Goose when I see her how cross you are," said Puss Jr., for he didn't like cross little boys, and neither do I, and neither do you, I'm sure. So little Jack Horner went back to his corner in the old stake fence, because he was in a great big meadow, you know, just covered with daisies, and pretty soon along came a great big fly, who took him where there was some pie in a baker's shop, and then he and Puss and Goosey Gander went with him and had a great feast. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 35, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 23, 2023. Chapter 36 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Old Miller. The miller he grinds his corn, the miller he grinds his corn, and Little Boy Blue comes winding his horn with a hop and a skip and a jump. A little bird in a tree nearby was singing this song, as Puss Jr. came inside of the old mill, where the water turned the mill wheel over and over, and the little silver fishes swam around and around in the quiet pond. And as soon as the rusty, dusty miller saw Puss Jr., he stepped out of the old mill and said, "Good day, my good Sir Cat. What brings you to my old mill?" Now, of course, Puss had no real reason for coming. He was just traveling along, seeking adventure, so he replied: "I have no corn for you to grind, my good miller, but will you sit down for a while and talk? I'm a traveler, seeking adventure, and I have seen many sights." Then the rusty, dusty miller sat down, but he didn't brush the flour off his hat nor off his coat, for it would only cover him again, you see, and what was the use of doing the same thing 3 and 4 times a day? And I guess that is the reason they called him the Rusty, Dusty Miller. "You know," said little Puss Jr., "my father is the famous Puss in Boots, seneschal to the Lord of Carabas." "I have read of him in a book," replied the miller. "So has everyone," said Puss Jr. with a grin. "But I am not contented to stay in one place. I must be ever on the go, and that is the reason I left the castle to seek my fortune." And Puss sighed and stroked his whiskers, for, after all, it's not such an easy thing to find a fortune. One must work for it, for he who spends must earn, as the old saying goes. "Well, I stay right here and grind the farmer's corn," said the miller, "and every morning they make the flour into cakes for little boys and girls. I find it is much better to be contented with one's lot than to be forever moving from one spot to another." And after that, the old miller dusted off his cap and patted the gray cat that came out of the mill to sit by his side. And wasn't it strange? She never took any notice of Puss Jr. at all. I guess she thought a cat with boots and spurs was not an ordinary cat, and maybe she was right in that, for Puss was very different from the cats you see every day in houses and barns. "Oh, every day I grind my corn, which the farmers bring at early dawn, and when I have tied the bags up tight, they come to get them every night. And then the meal is made into dough for cakes and puddings white as snow. I hope each child at breakfast time will think of the dusty miller's rhyme." End of chapter 36, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 27, 2023. Chapter 37 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Sweeping Cobwebs. You remember, in the last story, that Puss had made a visit on the rusty, dusty miller, who ground his corn at early dawn for the farmers to make into nice pies and cake. Well, after he had stayed a little while under the great willow tree that stood by the old mill, he walked away, and by he came to a hill. And right here I must tell you that Goosey Gander wasn't with him. You see, that old goose grew tired of flying with Puss on his back, and so decided to stay with the miller and eat corn for the rest of his life. Well, when Puss came to the foot of the hill, he said to himself, "Shall I climb this hill, or shall I turn off into the meadow and follow the brook?" And while he was wondering what to do, an old woman flew by in a basket. And she was the old woman who went up to the moon to see the man who came down too soon. And then a little yellow bird began to sing. There was an old woman tossed in a blanket, 17 times as high as the moon. But where she was going no mortal could tell, for under her arm she carried a broom. "Old woman, old woman, old woman," said I, "whither, oh whither, oh whither so high?" "To sweep the cobwebs from the sky, and I'll be with you by and by." "Please take me with you," cried little Puss Jr. So the old woman came down close to the meadow, and Puss jumped into her basket, and pretty soon they were flying high up in the air. And every time they came across a cobweb, she brushed it away with a broom, for she wanted the sky bright and clear, you see. And perhaps that is why the sky is so bright on Monday, for that is the day, so they tell me, she likes to do her sweeping. "What do you do on rainy days?" asked Puss. "Shine the rainbows, dearie," said the old woman. "Dear me," answered Puss, "and did you ever find the pot of gold that is hung at one end?" "No, not yet," she replied, "for the fairies are ever on the watch, and before I can get there, they take it away and hide it in the woods." "Well, I think you ought to be paid for keeping the sky so bright and clean," said Puss. But the old woman did not reply, for just then a strong wind blew the basket into a tree-top, where a robin had a nest full of pretty blue eggs. And when he saw Puss, he was frightened to death, for he was afraid of cats, you see, and so are all birds that I ever knew. "Don't worry," said our little traveler. "I won't steal your china blue eggs." And the old woman said, "Neither will I." And after that the robin felt so happy that he sang a song just as if nothing had happened. End of chapter 37, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 27, 2023.
Chapter 38 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Robin Hood. You remember in the last story that the old woman who flew in her basket across the sky and swept off the cobwebs with a broom had taken Puss Jr. for a ride, don't you? And that they had been blown into a tree where a little robin had his nest full of china blue eggs? Well, after that, the old woman and Puss climbed down to the ground, and the robin threw the basket down to them. And after that, who should come by but Robin Hood and his merry men, and they were all dressed in green, with great long bows and arrows, and oh dear me, they were a jolly lot. And when they saw the old woman with her magic basket, for it must have been a magic basket to fly through the air, don't you think so? They said, "Old woman, we have often read about you in Mother Goose. We are delighted to meet you." And then Puss Jr. stepped from behind the tree where he had been hiding, and when Robin Hood saw him, he said, "Puss in Boots, well, I declare!" And he held out his hand and shook our little traveler by the paw. "We have often read about your famous father," said the bold robber, for Robin Hood was a robber, you know, and if you don't, you must read about him. And then the old woman asked Robin Hood to mend a broken place in her basket, and after that she got into it and sailed away. Up in the sky, ever so high, I'll sweep the cobwebs off the sky. And pretty soon she disappeared, for the basket was going at a tremendous rate of speed. "Well, my little cat," said Robin Hood, "whither are you bound?" "I'm seeking my fortune," replied Puss Jr. "Ha, ha!" laughed Robin Hood. "This is a poor place to seek one's fortune, for my merry men and I take good care that we find any fortunes which may happen to be in sight." So after that, Puss thought he might as well be going on his way, and with a bow to the robbers bold, he started off, and by he came to a brook that was full of little silver fish, and the kingfish had a crown of gold on his head, and the queenfish had a golden throne. And when they saw Puss, they said, "Good day, Sir Cat, what brings you here?" And Puss replied, "I am seeking my fortune." "Look in the bottom of this stream," said the kingfish, "and you will find gold in plenty." And sure enough, on the bottom of the stream was a thick layer of gold. And Puss filled his purse and went upon his way. And in the next story you shall hear more of his adventures. End of chapter 38. Read by Snow Owl. Northwest Ohio, May 2023. Chapter 39 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Gingerbread Hut. Well, as Puss trudged along through the forest, where he had met Robin Hood and the generous kingfish, he noticed that the ground was strewn with little white pebbles, as if someone had dropped them to mark the way. And by he came in sight of a gingerbread cottage. And the gingerbread looked so nice and fresh that he broke off a little piece and ate it. And just then, all of a sudden, a voice cried out, "Nibble, nibble like a mouse. Who is nibbling at my house?" And after that, the door opened, and there stood an old witch leaning on a crutch. Her nose was very long and crooked, and her chin was crooked too, and they almost met, so that I don't see how she was able to eat. "Won't you come in, my dear?" she said in a cracked voice. "I will give you something to eat, but you mustn't eat up my house." And then she smiled, but it was a dreadful sort of smile. Oh dear, yes, it was a horrible grin. "I am not afraid," thought Puss, and he went inside. And then the witch said, "Gretel, get this nice cat something to eat, for I see he is a traveler, and a traveler is always hungry." So the little girl went to the cupboard and brought out some bread and milk. But oh dear me, she looked very sad, and her eyes were red with crying, I guess, for there were tears on her cheeks. And just then the little owl, who had sailed with Puss in the pea-green boat, flew into the cottage and whispered something to Puss. But the old witch didn't see him, for she was looking the other way. And what the little owl whispered was that Gretel's brother Hansel was locked up in the stable. And when Puss heard that, he was angry, for what right had that wicked witch to do such a thing as that? And all this time the old witch was busy making bread, and when the dough was ready to bake, she called to Gretel, "Is the oven hot?" And then the poor little girl began to cry, for she was dreadfully afraid of that wicked witch. So the witch went over to look in the oven, and as she leaned down to peep in, Puss gave her a great shove, and in she went, and before I've even time to tell it, he closed the door with a bang. And then he ran out to the barn and unlocked the door with a big key which he had found behind the kitchen door, and set little Hansel free. "And now you can both go home, for I know your mother is anxious about you," said Puss. So the two children started off at once, and followed the line of little white pebbles which the wise little Hansel had dropped when he and his sister had come into the great gloomy forest. And I know they both got home safely, for a little bird who had his nest near Gretel's window told me so just the other day. End of chapter 39. Read by Snow Owl, Northwest Ohio, May 2023.
Chapter 40 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Caleb Schroeder. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Baron Bruin. After Hansel and Gretel left the gingerbread cottage, where the wicked witch had made them prisoners, as I told you in the last story, Puss opened the oven door very carefully to see what had become of that dreadful witch. And what do you suppose he found? A big, smoke-colored feather. That was all. "Put it in your cap," said his little friend the owl. "It's a beautiful plume and will guard you against all evil." So Puss did, and he looked mighty handsome, let me tell you, with the long gray feather hanging down over his shoulder. And after that they both started off through the woods, for the owl's home was not very far away, and he was anxious to show Puss his family, Mrs. Owl and the two little owls, and maybe a cousin or two. Well, after a while, not so very long, they came to a big hollow tree. "This is where I live," said the owl. And when Mrs. Owl heard his voice, she looked out the front door, and the two little owls peeked out of the window. and then they all flew down to meet Puss. So he sat down and told them the story of the gingerbread witch, just as I've told it to you, and then it was time for him to be on his way. So he said good-bye and started off. And after a while, not so very long, he came to a little cottage in a garden where 2 rose bushes grew, one white and the other red. This must be where Snow White and Red Rose live, he thought, and then he went around to the back of the house, for no one answered his knock. And just then, all of a sudden, a big black bear came round the corner, and said in a deep growly voice, "How do you do, Sir Cat?" "How is your health, Baron Bruin?" answered Puss. And oh dear me, it was all he could do to keep his voice from trembling, for that bear was very big and fierce. "Don't be afraid of me," said the bear. "I'm off now into the woods to look after my treasures. You will find 2 of my treasures in the kitchen." And then he ran off into the wood. And when Puss reached the kitchen door, he knew what the bear had meant by saying 2 of his treasures were in the kitchen, for there stood Snow White and Rose Red, 2 of the prettiest little girls in all Fairyland. And they knew Puss, Jr., the minute they saw him, for they had read all about his famous father, Puss in Boots, you see. And after that, their mother came in and asked them to get her some firewood from the forest. So Puss went with them, and when they had gone into the forest just a little ways, they saw a dwarf whose long beard was caught under a fallen tree. He was tugging away, trying to free himself, and making the most dreadful faces all the while. "Go away and stop looking at me!" he cried, and he tugged some more, but his beard wouldn't come out from under the heavy trunk. And just then something happened. But you must wait to hear what it was in the next story, for I have no more room in this one. End of chapter 40.
Chapter 41 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anthony Smitha. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Bleating Goat. Let us see. We left off in the last story where the little dwarf was trying to pull his long beard from under the fallen tree, while Puss, Jr., and Snow White and Rose Red stood nearby watching him. And then something happened. Well, all of a sudden, the big black bear, who had called the 2 little girls his treasures, you remember, in the last story, came running up. "Now I've got you," he growled, taking hold of the dwarf. "Don't hurt him," said Puss, while the 2 little girls began to cry. "He is a wicked dwarf and has cast a spell over me," said the bear, and he stood up on his hind legs and threw back part of his long hair, showing a beautiful green embroidered suit beneath. "I am really a prince, but this wicked dwarf has turned me into a bear." So Puss called to Snow White and Rose Red and led them away. And then the bear sat down beside the dwarf and said to him, "Give me the ring on your little finger, or I will kill you." And the reason he wanted the little ring was because it was the secret of the little man's power, and if the bear once got it, he would regain his natural shape. But the dwarf wouldn't give up the ring, so the bear took it, and it wasn't such an easy thing to do either, for that little dwarf was very strong. And as soon as the bear put the ring on his own hand, he changed back into a handsome prince, and the little dwarf turned into a toadstool. And perhaps that is the reason toadstools are poisonous. But don't you eat any to find out, for I once knew of a little boy who did, and he had a dreadful stomach ache. And after that, Puss went upon his way, and as he journeyed along, he whistled to himself to keep up his spirits, for it is very lonely traveling by oneself, let me tell you. And by he heard a little goat bleating. And then a soft low voice said, "Bleat, little goat, bleat. Cover the table with something to eat." And then, all of a sudden, a little table appeared on the green meadow, and a little girl sat down to a lovely dinner, ice cream and apple pie and all sorts of good things. And of course, this was the most surprising thing that Puss had ever seen. And he looked all around to find a little goat. And then from behind a bush, a white goat appeared and sat down at the other end of the table. "I keep forgetting I'm in fairyland," thought Puss to himself, for, of course, all these things seemed very strange to him. And after the little girl had finished, she said, "Bleat, my little goat, I pray, and take the table quite away." And the next moment the table disappeared, and all that was left of the good things to eat. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anthony Smitha. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Magic Tree. You remember in the last story that as soon as the little goat bleated, the table disappeared, with all the good things to eat. And then Puss said to the little girl, "I wish I had a little goat like yours. He'd make a fine companion to me on my travels." "I couldn't part with him," said the little girl, whose name was Two Eyes, "for without him I should only have crusts to eat." "Oh, are you the Two Eyes in the fairy story-book?" asked Puss, and he curled his whiskers and smiled at her. And after that he went home with her and the little goat, and when they were quite near her house, she said, "I fear my mother and sisters will treat you ill if you come into the house." So Puss said he'd sleep in the stable with the little goat. Early next morning Puss was awakened by a noise, and, peeking out of the stable, he saw one of the cruel sisters bending over the poor little goat which she had just killed to spite Two Eyes. "What shall I do?" he thought. And then, all of a sudden, a wonderful tree sprang up from the spot where the poor little goat's blood had been spilled. Its leaves were silver, and its fruit gold, and the morning wind made it sing like a harp. And after that a handsome prince rode up on horseback, and the three cruel sisters, on seeing him, pushed poor little Two Eyes under a barrel which they were about to fill with the golden apples. But the noble prince didn't see this, for he was still too far away. And when he rode up, he asked for some of the golden fruit. But, oh dear me, when those cruel sisters tried to pick the golden apples, the boughs of the wonderful tree sprang away from their hands, and they couldn't touch the fruit. "Now's the time for me to do something," thought Puss, and he ran out of the stable and said, "Noble prince, the fairest of the four sisters is hidden in this barrel. 'Tis she who owns this wonderful tree, and only she can pluck the fruit." And as soon as he heard that, the noble prince sprang from his horse and lifted up the barrel, and there sat little Two Eyes, with her lap full of golden apples. "Take her away with you," whispered Puss, "for she is most cruelly treated by her family." And then the prince lifted her up on his horse, and after that he took Puss in his arms and sprang into the saddle, and away they went on his fast horse to his stately castle in the green woods, far away. Over the meadows and over the lea, the noble prince is riding so free, with little Two Eyes for his beautiful bride, and little Puss Jr. safe at his side. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of the Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anthony Smitha. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Little Door in the Stump. "Hi-ho! Now for another adventure," said little Puss Jr. as he walked merrily along the King's Highway. For there are beautiful roads in Mother Goose Land, let me tell you, and happy little people all about. And just then, all of a sudden, the jolly miller from the River Dee, who looked upon his pillow and saw a great big flea, came along, and when he saw Puss Jr., he said, "Ha-ha, little friend, do we meet again?" And then he took Puss by the arm, and together they went down the road until they came to a stile, where the maiden all forlorn in days gone by used to stand and cry. But nowadays she smiled, for she was as happy as could be, and the reason was because the man all tattered and torn had made a lot of money and had married her, and they lived in a pretty house on the hill near by. And when she saw Puss and the jolly miller, she laughed out loud and said, "Puss in Boots, Jr., I'm so glad to see you." And do you know, she picked him up and kissed him, although at one time she had cried when the man all tattered and torn had kissed her. But that, of course, was before he had shaved and made a lot of money. And after that, Puss went upon his way, and after a while he came to a thick forest, so he left the highway and trudged along a little path which wound in and out among the trees. And by he grew so tired he sat down to rest on an old stump. And while he sat there, wondering where next to go, his sword hit the old stump, and, to his surprise, a little door flew open, and there, right in plain sight, was a little blue egg. And when Puss picked it up, it also opened, and inside was a bright gold key. "Fit this to the little yellow door," sang a yellow bird from a tree-top near by. So Puss did as he was told, and when he had opened another little door on the inside of the old stump, he saw a narrow passage, which he followed. But first he drew his sword from the scabbard, for he wasn't going to take any chances of meeting an ugly gnome, I can tell you. Well, pretty soon, not so very far, he came to a large room where sat a queer little figure dressed in green. "Good day, Sir Cat," said the gnome, for it was one of the little men who live underground, you know. "What can I do for you?" "I am seeking a fortune," replied Puss. "Ha-ha!" laughed the little man. "And do you expect to find it for that reason?" And then he laughed again, and the cave shook and trembled, for he laughed very loud, you see, and then a great big diamond fell from the roof. "Take the precious stone," said the dwarf. "You have found your fortune." And in the next story you shall hear what Puss did with the beautiful diamond. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anthony Smitha. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Puss Goes West. Over the hills and far away, out in the west where the sky is gray, till the sun goes down o'er the purple hills, and the clouds are fringed with their crimson frills. Out in the west where the mountain crest goes to sleep in the sky's blue breast, and the tall green grass on the prairie sings to the tune the west wind gaily brings. This is what the little yellow bird sang as Puss, Jr., with the beautiful big diamond which the dwarf had just given him in the last story, walked out of the old hollow stump. "And now that you have found your fortune," said the bird, "what are you going to do with it?" "Leave that to me," said Puss gaily. "There is plenty to do with a fortune." And away he went merrily on his way until he came to a pretty village, and the first shop he came to was a jewelry store. So in he went and showed the big diamond to the man behind the counter.
"Goodness me!" he exclaimed. "What a magnificent diamond!"
And would you believe it, he gave Puss over £1,000 for it. So Puss put the money in his pocket and started off again, and you may well believe he felt as rich as a king, for £1,000 in Mother Goose Land is indeed a fortune. "And now I'm going west," said Puss to himself, "for that is where the yellow bird says everything is new and wonderful." Well, by and by, after Puss had gone for many a mile, he came across Old Mother Goose on her gander. She was sitting on the roof of a big red barn, and her gander was in the barnyard eating corn. But as soon as she saw Puss, she came down to earth and asked him to go with her. "My gander can easily take two," she said, "for although he is a trifle older than when we last met, he is still as strong as ever." So Puss got up behind the old lady, and away they went, over tree-top and steeple, chimney and mountain, until they came to the western part of Old Mother Goose Land, where lived a great giant called Energy. He was oh so big and strong, and his cheeks were as red as the sunset, and his eyes as bright as stars, and his arms as big as an oak tree, and stronger. "This is little Puss Junior," said Mother Goose. "He wishes to see the west." And then the giant stretched out his hand and picked up Puss and smiled. And in the next story you shall hear what the big giant said, for he said it so loud that I heard it, although he was so far away. And then the big round sun turned a somersault over the mountain top and rolled down the other side like a great ball of fire, and all the little fairies began to sing a sleepy song to put the giant's children to sleep. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anthony Smitha. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. On the Way to Fairyland. You remember in the last story we left Puss, Jr. with the big western giant on his purple hilltop just as the sun was going down. Well, in a little while after that it grew very dark, so the giant said, "Mother Goose, you and Puss Jr. come into my castle for the night." So in they went, and oh dear me, wasn't it a big place! It was so large that Puss felt smaller than a fly, and the chairs were so high that he couldn't even see the bottoms of the seats. And as for the table, well, it looked like the roof of a big building. But the giant only laughed when he saw how amazed Puss was, and he leaned over and picked him up in his great hand and set him on the top of the table. And then the gander flew up too, with Mother Goose on his back, but even then the giant's head towered above them like a church bell in a high steeple. "I once met the giant of the beanstalk," said little Puss Jr., "but he wasn't nearly so big as you." And then this big giant began to laugh, and oh dear me, when he laughed, the castle shook and trembled, and the great chandelier tinkled and twinkled, for it was all made of crystals, you know, like the kind grandmother used to have in her house when I was a little boy. And after that the giant showed them where they were to sleep, and in the morning, when Puss got up to dress, he saw his great host walking in the garden picking roses that were bigger than cabbages. So Puss hurried down and went out into the garden, and as soon as the giant saw him, he said, "Come to the stables, my little cat." And then, wasn't it generous in that giant? He gave Puss a beautiful horse. It was really a pony, although it was as big as a horse. And then Puss rode away, after saying good-bye to Mother Goose and the giant's family. Well, after Puss had ridden for many a mile, he came to a bridge, and on a sign was written, "This is the way to Fairyland." Just over the bridge and far away is the land where the fairies love to play, where dwarves and gnomes and wonderful things are seen by him who merrily sings. So Puss started right away to sing a song. "Oh, I'm the famous Puss in Boots, I'm his famous son. I've traveled far from moon to star, and my journey's just begun." And before he could sing any more, up jumped a little fairy right in his path, and waved her hand. And of course Puss Junior's horse stopped and neighed, for he wasn't used to fairies, you know. He didn't mind giants, but he had never seen little tiny people before. And in the next story you shall hear more about Puss in Fairyland. End of chapter 45.
Chapter 46 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylvie Wolf. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. Chapter Dreams. You remember in the last story, a little fairy stopped Puss Jr. on his horse at the entrance to Fairyland. Well, after she had waved a wand, she said, "Welcome, Puss in Boots Jr., to Fairyland. Come, I will lead you to the Prince of the Fairies." And then she waved a wand again, and the butterfly appeared, and, seating herself on its back, she flew away with Puss Jr. following on his horse. And by they came to a lovely dell, where the Fairy Queen was seated on a throne made of red rose leaves. And she was the most beautiful fairy in the whole forest. "Make a wish, Sir Cat," she cried, "and I will grant it, for you are in Fairyland, you know, where wishes come true and dreams are real." "Am I really in such a wonderful country?" cried our little traveler, as he jumped off his horse and bowed very low at the foot of the throne. "Then I will make my wish. But I'm not going to tell you what it was, but let you find it out." And while Puss made this wish, the Fairy Queen waved a wand over his head. And would you believe it, the next minute Puss Jr. found himself back at the castle of my Lord Carabas. And there was his father, the famous Puss in Boots, sitting under a tree in the rose garden. "Oh, father dear!" cried little Puss. "Here I am back again!" And the old cat opened his eyes, for he had been dozing, you know. And when he saw his son, he jumped up from the chair and threw his paws around him. "My dear, dear boy!" he cried, and the tears came to his eyes. He was so happy. And then they both sat down, and Puss told them about all his travels and how the Fairy Queen had granted his wish. And Puss Junior's father didn't seem to think it strange at all. He only smiled and patted his son on the top of the head, just between the ears, the very place where cats like to be tickled, you know. And then, all of a sudden, little Puss Junior found himself in the woods. But there was no Fairy Queen in sight, and her throne of red roses was gone. Only the big horse, which the giant had given him, was there, quietly grazing on a grassy place nearby. So Puss rubbed his eyes and looked about him. "Have I been dreaming?" he asked himself. But, of course, nobody answered. Only the big horse looked up and brushed a fly off his leg with his long flowing tail. "Dear me," said Puss, "was it only a dream? But how is nice to dream, I think. to dream if dreams come true. And if they don't, maybe it's nice. I would rather, wouldn't you? For then at least we do the things we've often tried to do. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sylvia Wolf. Travels of Puss in Boots Jr. by David Cory. Chapter The Ruby Ring. Fairyland is a strange place, said Puss to himself as he travelled along on his back horse. And after a while he came to a queer little hut, and when he knocked at the door, for he was hungry and wished for something to eat, a little old woman opened it and said, "What do you wish, little traveller?" "Something to eat," said Puss, "and some oats for my horse if you have them." And then the little old woman went out to her stable and gave the horse some oats and took Puss inside her hut and gave him food. And then she got out her spinning wheel and said, "Now tell me one of your adventures, Sir Cat, for I see you are the traveller." "I have journeyed all through Mother Goose's land," replied Puss, and he crossed his legs and curled his whiskers while he tried to think of a story to tell her. "One day while I was travelling," Puss began, "I met Yankee Doodle Dandy riding on his pony, and when I jumped up on his horse he wasn't all alone." And this funny little verse made the old woman laugh, but she didn't think that a cat, even one who wore red-top boots, could make up poetry as he went along. And it does seem marvelous to me that Puss could do it, for I never heard of a cat who was a poet. "Well, what did you do after that?" asked the old woman. "Oh, we rode along until we came to a town called Norwich," answered Puss. "That's the place where the man in the moon who came down too soon wanted to go, you know. Only he went by the south and burnt his mouth by eating cold plum porridge." And this made the old woman laugh still harder, for she couldn't see how cold porridge would burn one's mouth, and neither do I, and neither do you, and the only reason I can think that maybe it did was because the porridge was made in Mother Goose's land, and some things there are suddenly very queer indeed. And just then there came a tap at the door of the hut, and when the old woman opened it, a funny little man, dressed in red with a peaked hat on his head, stepped inside. "Good woman," he said, and he took off his little cap and showed his bald head as shiny as a china egg. "I have been commanded by the king of the dwarfs to give Puss Jr. this ring." And Puss Jr. surprised, the little man handed him a beautiful ruby ring. "Goodness me," said Puss. "Why did your king send me this?" "Because he once knew your father, the famous Puss in Boots," replied the dwarf, "and is anxious to do his son a favor. And maybe Puss wasn't pleased. Well, I just guess he was, for it was a magic ring and would keep away evil and all sorts of trouble. And in the next story you shall hear how lucky Puss was to have this beautiful ruby ring. End of chapter 47.
Chapter 48 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Dreadful Bat. Let me see. It was in the last story, I think, I promised to tell you how the magic ring saved Puss Jr. from danger. Well, this is the way it happened. After he left the hut of the little old woman, he went deep into the forest, and by it became very dark, and the trees grew so close together, and the brambles so thick, that Puss could go no farther. So he looked about him, and then, to his dismay, he found that the brambles held him fast, and after that, all of a sudden, a great bat flew near and said, "You are my prisoner." Oh, dear me! Puss did not know what to do, for the brambles held his paws close to his side, and he was unable to draw his sword. And then the bat whirred round and round, and flew so close to Puss Junior's face that he had to close his eyes. And this was just what the dreadful bat wanted him to do. And then he took Puss Junior's sword away from him, and maybe he would have killed our little traveler if, all of a sudden, that dear little yellow bird, who is always singing or saying something, hadn't twittered from a tree-top. "Turn your magic ruby ring thrice around your finger. Touch the bat upon the wing. Hasten, do not linger." And then, would you believe it, the brambles parted, so Puss could raise his paws, and, quicker than a wink, he turned the ruby ring around 3 times, and then touched the bat on the wing with it. And what do you think happened then? Why, that dreadful bat turned into a toadstool, and Puss took up his sword, which had fallen on the ground, and cut that toadstool's head right off. And it was a good thing he did, for somebody might have mistaken that toadstool for a mushroom and eaten it, and toadstools are poisonous, you know. And then that little yellow bird flew down from the tree-top, and Puss gave her some crumbs he had in his pocket, and after that she perched herself on his shoulder and showed him the way out of the forest. And when they came to the broad highway, she flew away, but before she went, she whispered in his ear, "Don't forget your magic ring." And after that, Puss came to a deep river, and as there was no bridge, he didn't know how to cross over. So he sat down on the bank, and while he sat there, a big fish swam up and said to him, "Do you want to cross over? If you do, get on my back and I will take you over." So Puss jumped on his back, and away they went, and Puss didn't get the least bit wet, for the fish was very careful. And in the next story you shall hear what happened after that. End of chapter 48. Read by Olivia.
Chapter 49 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. Some Old Friends. You remember in the last story that a kind of fish took Puss Jr. across the river on his back. Well, as soon as Puss set foot on earth, he started off on his travels, and by, he came to Plum Pudding Town, and the first person he met was little Jack Horner asleep in his corner. I guess he had eaten so many plums that it made him sleepy. Well, anyway, Puss took the tip of his tail and tickled Jack's ear, and then, of course, the little boy woke up. And when he saw Puss, he was so glad that he ran into the baker's shop and bought a Christmas pie with as many plums as you have fingers and I have thumbs. "Who else lives in this town?" asked Puss, when the pie was all gone. "Oh, the Queen of Hearts, who makes fine tarts," answered Jack Horner, "and the cold plum porridge man, and the patter cake baker's man, and lots more besides." "Well, I must hurry on," said Puss. "If I wait here, I may eat too much." And away he went once more upon his journey, and by, after maybe a mile, he came to a stile, where stood a fat pig with a very fine wig. But he wasn't the pig that went to Bonner, but another pig who was going to Londonderry. "Let us go together," said Puss, "for traveling alone is sorry business." So he and the pig started off, and, after a while, they came to a place that was all marshy. There were great tall cattails and coarse wiry grass and little pools of water, and right in the middle of a large pool sat an immense big frog. "Tra-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la," he sang, only his voice was very low and deep. "Is your name Rowley?" asked Puss. for he had once met the frog that would a wooing go, only it was so long ago that he had forgotten how Rowley looked. "Yes, I am Rowley," said the frog, "and I'm now a lot wiser. Never again will I leave my pool." And then he sang this little song: "A frog who would a wooing go had better have a care, and not suppose, because his clothes are gay and debonair, that every lady frog who sees him will most anxious be to please him." And then Rowley sighed and croaked so mournfully that Puss and the pig ran away. For mournful people, you must remember, are not liked nearly as well as those who smile and laugh. And in the next story you shall hear about a little dog who laughed because a dish ran after a spoon. That is, if the dish doesn't catch the spoon and eat it up. End of chapter 49. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 30, 2023. Chapter 50 of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory. The Little Rug Man. Let me see. Just as I was ending the story before this, I made you a promise to tell you about a little dog who laughed because a dish ran after a spoon. Well, I guess you would have laughed too, if you had seen such a sight, and so would I, and so would the King of France, and the President of England. And the way it all happened was this. After the cow had jumped over the moon, which had happened a long time ago when Puss first started out on his travels, you know, the dish kept on rolling and rolling and rolling, and the spoon kept hopping and hopping, and they both went so far that, by and by, they came to an old farmhouse, and on the back porch was a little woolly dog, and when he saw the dish running after the spoon, he began to laugh. And if the dish hadn't suddenly run into a rose bush, I'm afraid that little dog would have laughed himself to death. And it happened just then that Puss Jr. came by, and so he picked up the plate and called to the spoon to stop running away. "You don't want to keep this up forever and ever," said our little traveler. And then the farmer's wife came out of the house. "Goodness me!" she cried. "Here are some little people from Mother Goose Land." And then she began to sing. "I love to read dear Mother Goose, those dear old nursery rhymes, where every one had lots of fun in those old merry times. And little Jack Horner sat in his corner, and the pig flew up in the air, and Goosey Goose Gander, so crazy to wonder, met the old man who fell down the stair." And, goodness me! She might have kept on singing till doomsday if, all of a sudden, a blackbird hadn't flown down and picked a cherry off her favorite tree. And this made her so angry that she took off one of her shoes and threw it at him, and of course he didn't wait to pick the cherry. And after that, Puss said good-bye and went upon his way. And before I tell you what happened to him, the farmer's wife took the runaway dish and spoon into her kitchen and locked them up in her cupboard, and now they look down from the shelf like ordinary dishes and spoons do, who have never seen a cow jump over a moon. Well, as Puss jogged along, he came across a queer little man sitting on a rug. And this seemed so funny that Puss stopped to ask him what he was doing. "Sit down beside me," said the funny little man, and when Puss did, the rug went up into the air just like an airship. Over the hills and far away it sailed, and in the next story you shall hear more about this magic rug. Now, in the last story, I promised to tell you more about the magic rug, but I'm dreadfully sorry to say there is no more room in this book for another story. So, do you know what I'm going to do? Well, I'll tell you right away. I am putting some more Puss in Boots stories in another book, which is to be called Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland. So if you want to hear more about him, you can, for he has some exciting adventures with giants and gnomes and meets many old friends of yours and mine in Fairyland. End of chapter 50, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, May 30, 2023. End of Travels of Puss in Boots, Jr. by David Cory.